Hello, welcome to my stream tonight. I'm very excited to be talking again about Marko. Obviously, there's a little bias there. I work on the Marko team, but I would say maybe a month or so, maybe a month and a half back, I did a Marko specific stream where I can introduce people to kind of like the basic concept behind Marko, and it kind of kicked off like the next several streams that I did over the following weeks. We looked into React server components. We looked into Qwik. And yeah, I'm not going to lie, this partially was all just to kind of establish the kind of knowledge base I wanted to have to actually talk about the next version of Marko, Marko 6, which I'm very excited about because I think it brings a lot of really neat innovations beyond what Marko's already been doing. The stuff that I was talking about before was largely Marko's been doing since I think 2017 with Marko 4. So it's going to be really cool to kind of take a first look at, I mean, I've already given some kind of previews, but actually look at, Marko 6 in action. But yeah, before we kind of go there, I'm going to give it a minute or so before we get into the whole This Week in JavaScript. If you're here, how do you say hi in the chat? Let me see who's here. Hello. Yeah, I'm actually just playing with some different banner styles this week because the old ones are taking up the whole screen. So give that kind of a little go. Okay, looking better. Hi. Thanks for joining me today. As I said, this one is a little bit special for me because we've been really working on what I think is really interesting stuff, and I've been talking about it, but I haven't been able to showcase it. So I think it's gonna be a lot of fun. So we're gonna get started here in a minute, but yeah, I don't know. You know what? Let's just do it. Let's get into This Week in JavaScript, because honestly, it's been this last 2 weeks. I missed this. I skipped this stream last week, and it was for a couple of reasons, but honestly, I didn't want to add to the noise that was going on. Unfortunately, and it looks like it's going to last a while, but there is the conflict going on with Russia and the Ukraine, and I really didn't feel right streaming last week when that was just unfolding. Unfortunately, it seems like the situation's only getting worse. So here we are, but we're going to do what we do, and our best wishes go out to them. Okay, so yeah, let me show some stuff. So kind of going back about 2 weeks, this really kind of started a lot of solid news. As I mentioned previously, we State of JavaScript survey happened, and the other big thing was right around the last stream, we actually open the submissions to Solid Hack, and we've already seen the first several submissions come in. It's really cool to kind of see what people have been building. I've been trying to retweet stuff as people submit it. So if any of you have projects, go ahead, share them on Twitter, tag us, hashtag Solid Hack, and I'll look for them and try and retweet them and get more visibility on them. Really cool stuff going on, different projects. What was another thing? Yeah, I mean, a lot of solid news. Vercel sponsorship. A lot of people seem really excited about that. It's definitely cool to have them. Now we have all the big cloud providers behind us: Netlify, Cloudflare, and Vercel. A lot of real interest in Solid. So I'm looking forward to see how I can work with them, and how the team can work with them in the future to make Solid even better. Some teasers from Capacitor for some mobile Solid. Honestly, I'm just so stoked at all these projects coming in, and you're gonna see a ton of these Chakra UI and even some Web3 stuff going on. So a lot of really cool projects been kind of going on with Solid. Another thing is we were on Hacker News. Our article went to #1, which was kind of a funny article. I'm gonna say. I mean, it's very similar to some talks that I gave previously, but if you didn't see it, it's kind of kicked off this whole discussion again about signals versus hooks, and it's all about all the pitfalls of trying to do a set interval, and how much more straightforward it is with a reactive library. Like, this isn't solid only that acts like this, but it did stir up a lot of conversations. I thought there was a lot of interesting talk on it. I was actually kind of surprised about the response from it, because I said it was number one in Hacker News, a lot of attention, and people were generally really positive. Like, it's even spawned people in the industry like Andrew Stalt's critter Cycle.js, comparing stuff. And even Adam Rakis had some nice stuff to say about Solid, which isn't always that common, which spawned out pretty much every single framework to, give their example. And God, this meme came back again. Everyone knows how much I love this meme. Just put the script tag in, if you, whatever, make things even. We got the svelte version now. We got, we just so many people just sharing their stuff, right? I think there's a Vue version in here. Vue is almost identical to this. There's a Vue version, and then Rich is being cheeky as always, telling everyone how it's literally 60% more characters than the svelte version, which meant, what happens whenever someone gets cocky about line numbers. I have to pull out Marko, because if you want to write less code, and we'll see more of this tonight, it's difficult to write less code than Marko. In fact, you guys even made me pull out the concise mode version. I mean, you can say what you want, but Marko's tag syntax with concise mode, which is our kind of pug syntax, is incredibly terse. So if that's your cup of tea, I don't know, it's mine. I think I prefer the tags look. This is definitely less characters than pretty much anything out there. It was an interesting little conversation. Definitely to kind of have that attention on syntax again. It's funny because usually that's not where I put my focus. I care more about performance and whatnot. But it definitely was good. Solid hit 15,000 stars on GitHub due to this kind of attention, got more likes, and I think we're at 15.3. We're already up another 300 stars in the last couple of days from that. Just continuing growing interest, and it's been really awesome to see. We also had some interesting conversations with Ryan Florence and the Remix guys. It seems that's where my conversations go this week, or in general recently. Just talking about the differences between routing, and I think we're going to get into that tonight, because basically there's this whole idea of like, he's completely right. One of the biggest problems we have in the web architecture, especially with single page apps, is waterfalls and when to fetch. And these things are solvable even without server rendering. They're solvable without suspense to a certain degree, although that makes certain things easier. But there are lots of ways to solve these problems. But a lot of naive approaches to data fetching make them very unoptimal. So good conversation, good thoughts there. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of conversations. I think that's really what this week in JavaScript was about. The last one I kind of want to bring up here for a moment is this Hacker News story. This one had even more points and comments than the solid one, which was single page apps were a mistake. And this is a pretty crazy one, because I mean, it wasn't a badly written article, and the author was just saying that there's a time and a place and they shouldn't be the default. But generally speaking, they kind of have become the de facto default. People do want them for building stuff. And as much as a lot of people on the MPA side want to return to that history, we're just not quite going back there. Don't get me wrong, we are going back to MPAs, but like, I'll show you something what I mean. I'm going to search in this article and put in the word Marko. You're going to find it 0 times. I'm going to put in the word Astro. You're going to find it 0 times. Let's try Qwik. And the reason that you don't see any of that, even though there's freaking 580 comments, is because most of the MPA side is sort of not JavaScript on the back end. Like, that's why they want it. It isn't about because they care about MPAs necessarily. They do. But this kind of mentality that maybe JavaScript doesn't like belong on the server, or whatnot. And that's why it's kind of interesting that even in the MPA conversation, and I mentioned this in our previous stream, Marko's kind of been the odd man out. Now there's more frameworks that are doing MPAs in JavaScript. And it's kind of unfortunate because MPAs, in my opinion, in JavaScript are the secret to how you actually unlock sending less JavaScript. Because yes, sure, you can send less JavaScript with your Rails app or PHP, but you're managing two apps. It's a different thing. If you actually want a chance at getting that best of both worlds experience, it's only happening today, I think, with JavaScript on the server. WebAssembly in the client is the other option, but that hasn't been really proven viable yet. We've looked into that in the past too. So I think it's interesting because they're talking past each other. And I've talked about this before in the past, but I think these arguments are going nowhere. I think we need to focus on the future. And in order to do that, we have to actually embrace the benefits and the good parts of each side and understand what the trade-offs are. And having people go on and on about the return to the Rails backends or whatever, it's just, it's the same thing. It's not like they don't have a point, but as I said, we're not meeting anywhere in the middle. And as I said, it's unfortunate because I think solutions that potentially offer these solutions on the JavaScript side are kind of getting overlooked by the MPA crowd that would otherwise probably be pretty into this. They've kind of aligned themselves more with web components and low build and that side. And I'm sorry, but that's probably like, that doesn't change anything. That's just a sure way to end up being in the same mentality we were in, a decade ago, right? Because sure, we didn't have web components, but it's that same thinking of almost underwriting JavaScript. No, you gotta, if you want to embrace MPAs, if you want to get away from sending too much JavaScript to the browser, your best bet is to actually embrace JavaScript. I know, crazy, but that's what we've seen. You've been exploring it with me the last several weeks on the stream, and tonight is no different. We're going to bring in the guys from Marko to actually talk about that. I'm super excited about it because you have to understand, to put this in context. I've been talking about this a lot on my stream. Obviously, I'm big on partial hydration and the different technologies that we potentially have here to work with multi-page apps and whatnot. But picture the difference that is for the guys working at Marko. They've been doing this years longer than really anyone else in the field. I mean, Mishko on the last stream was telling us how he'd been looking into this stuff, for quite some time. And he did a talk in 2019, basically laying out Qwik. And the thing is, Marko's been doing these sort of techniques, maybe not as advanced as we got today, since 2014. Both my guests today have been actively working on the Marko project for I think 5 years and 6 years respectively. So this is some of the best expertise we have in the industry on this hydration problem and MPAs and whatnot. So it's a real treat for me to introduce both Michael Rawlings and Dylan Piercey to add them to the stream here tonight. So welcome, both of you guys. I am so stoked to have you on the stream. Obviously, I get to work with you every day, so you're all
yeah.
We're glad to finally be on here.
Yeah, I'm excited.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, this is going to be a lot of fun because I want you guys to actually in the audience to, as we go along and do this, ask your questions, ask the controversial stuff, because honestly, these guys will give you some of the best answers you see. And honestly, they'll probably argue with each other. Like this is how our work goes. Seriously, they work so awesome together. And a lot of that comes in the form of disagreement, which is funny because I think you guys will probably witness this a bit, but it really gives a leveled look at the whole perspective when you have both sides of the argument coming through. And as I said, feel free to ask questions as we go along, because I think this is going to be a lot of fun and there's a lot of potential to learn here. But yeah, before we go to that, actually, I figured the easiest way for us to actually get started on this conversation before we even talk too much more about Marko is, like, I want to ask the question, How did you both get into Marko? Like, how did you find yourselves working on Marko? So I don't know if you want to go first, Michael, but just give us a little background.
Sure. So I kind of randomly found Marko. I was looking for a templating language really that supported streaming, and basically turned out that there was Dust and Marko for Node.js. And so I started playing around with Marko a little bit. I was on a Windows PC at the time and found a bug related to the Windows line ending. So my first PR was to fix that.
It's always Windows.
It's always Windows. We've had many more, especially since I switched away from Windows. And yeah, I got talking to Patrick, who was the original author of Marko, and eventually joined the Marko team. The thing that actually I really enjoyed about Marko from the start, and I think what Patrick kind of saw and was kind of interested in, was the compiler, because before I even jumped into any of the like client side aspect of it, I was trying to build like a visual CMS where you could kind of annotate the HTML and then it would swap it out for like editable components of, so you could just like type on, you know, as you're writing the HTML, you could annotate it, be like, this title's editable, and it would swap it out with a component that would like talk back to the database. And that CMS never got released, but a lot of that was done through compile time transforms that you could just put an attribute on there and it would actually like do a bunch of stuff through the compiler to transform things.
Cool. No, that's. And then what, Patrick just poached you at that point? He's like, come work on my project, or?
Yeah. It happened to be really good timing. So it worked out.
That's awesome. And Dylan, how about you give a little background for yourself?
Yeah, so for me, really before I joined Marko, I was working on a different framework that was a router that was designed to essentially act as an isomorphic router, so it would pick up where the server left off, kind of thing. And my whole kick at that point in time was progressively enhance everything, because I had to support older browsers, including IE9, and I really just didn't want to do that. And progressive enhancement seemed like a good way to do it. And then the other thing is, I was kind of on the same train as the Remix guys are today, where it's like, if the experience is progressively enhanced, who cares how much JavaScript I'm sending? I'm sending a whole router to the browser. But anyways, through that router, I ended up looking into Marko as I was adding integrations to the router.
Wasn't it mostly a React framework?
It was a framework agnostic router, but I was using it with React at the time. And then I realized React was too large, because I started going down the path of like, okay, this is too much JavaScript for the browser. And then eventually kind of landed on learned about Marko and tried to integrate it, and got talking with Michael and Patrick, and the rest is kind of history there.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So and when was that? That was back in what, 2016 time period? 15, 16 time?
17, I think.
Yeah.
In 2016, Dylan actually sent me a message about Rill, and I totally ignored him.
Rill being my router.
Yeah. Because I had worked on a similar project. And it was funny because I had actually used some of Dylan's open source projects even a year or two before that. So we had this like kind of like never actually interacted with each other, but we had like looked at, you know, each other's projects and like even used some of the same ideas. So it was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I was obsessed with routers at the time. In my brain, a lot of the things that were put into that router are ideas that are similar in concept to what Remix is doing today. But we've never been able to crack a router that works in the same way with Marko. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk about that particular piece today.
I hope that, yeah, we'll get to that definitely a bit later on.
Yeah.
But I mean, where we probably should start is because hopefully some people watched the previous stream where I dug into Marko, talked about some of the benefits. I can't remember if I showed that great partial hydration demo with Remix and Marko, where Marko's like twice the speed. It was just the partial hydration has a huge impact, not only on JavaScript execution, but it can have a huge impact on data serialization. And I think we're going to come into that a bit today. So how about we're going to talk a minute about, I'm trying to think about how the order I want to do, but we probably should just kind of introduce the main topic today, because we're talking about Marko 6 and how it goes in the future. So if either of you, I know you guys will probably fight for it. Can you talk a little bit about Marko 6 and what the high level goals are with it?
Yeah, I can take it. Yeah, so Marko 6 is really, it's a huge release for us, but I mean, ultimately our two goals kind of from the beginning is how do we deliver like the best DX while maintaining the performance characteristics of a multi-page app. That is sending like as little JavaScript as possible and having, as fast of an experience as possible. And that's quite challenging to do. And obviously, Marko is kind of in its niche. But so specifically what's gone into Marko 6 is sort of a rethinking of our API to make it so that a whole bunch of things are possible. And I think without showing it, it's hard to explain, but it allows for things like aggressive collocation and also much greater compile time static analysis, which will allow us to do crazy things like aggressive tree shaking and a whole bunch more. So that's really what it is for us. It's a two-pronged approach of let's make the DX as good as we can, and let's send as little JavaScript to the browser as possible. And the really interesting thing about this current iteration of Marko is that it's really, really piecemeal. Like it's going to be splitting hairs going past this level of enhancement, which is really cool. And the architecture that we've kind of landed on has opened some other doors that I think is really interesting as well.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And we've been looking on the stream at some, perhaps similar technologies. And one of the, I guess, things is how we achieve that with Marko 6. I think we were looking at it, almost bullet pointed it down to maybe two or three specific types of technological approaches. Can you speak to that? Maybe to Dylan or?
Yeah. So you mean as far as like the actual optimization side of things?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, there's really one core thing as far as Marko is concerned related to sending as little JavaScript to the browser today, which is partial hydration. Obviously, that's been talked about on this stream before. And really all it is, Marko being a compiler can look at the tree and determine what the top level components are. And so we're able, and by top level components, I mean those that have, client-side behaviors. Anything that doesn't have a client-side behavior stays on the server. That's the goal, right? So we want to
rebranding this concept islands.
Yeah, so islands is a part of it. So with that, I mean, essentially what we're doing is, sending these little islands. We automatically determine what they are to the browser, re-execute just those. We have the JavaScript for just those, and it's a pretty big, significant improvement. But what we're doing in Marko 6, which is pretty awesome actually, is dividing up your application instead of by these, like, this is a client-side component, this is a server component, and telling what that is. Instead, we're splitting things up based off of the reactive graph at compile time. So looking at all of the dependencies for any expression that's within the template, and we split up the output component into all of these different functions that can be independently tree shakeable. So what that ends up meaning is that instead of looking at things on a per component basis, is this one sent to the browser? Is this one on the server? We're able to actually look at, okay, you've defined some state here. It's used over here. It's used over here. It's derived here. And it ultimately makes it into this place. And we can actually send, if it's necessary, if that part can re-render, we can send just those chunks of functions to the browser, which is actually huge because you can imagine a really simple component that, has some state in it nonetheless. But maybe it has like some icons, some big SVGs, like who knows what. There's lots of static stuff in our components, and all of that can now be tree shaken automatically without you having to think about it, and that's huge. So that's one of the optimizations, is really just breaking things up into a million different pieces based off of their dependencies. And then the other piece of it is basically the resumability side of things. And so, obviously, if you think about hydration, and this has been talked about in Ryan's stream before with Qwik and so on, the ideal world for hydration is pick up where the server left off. Don't redo work that the server did. So what did the server do? The server rendered a bunch of HTML. What can't the server do? The server can't add event listeners, and the server can't run your life cycles or event or your like effects and stuff like that. And so how do we get to a system where essentially the browser is just running the effects and attaching event handlers? And essentially, one of the other things we've done with the compiler is it has knowledge not only of their like all of the dependencies, it also knows which expressions should run in the browser versus can be executed only on the server. And so we split things up in that way as well. I think showing the actual like compiled output for that might make things make more sense. But essentially, what happens is you render on the server. We instead of like tracking, these are the top level components, we're like, here are some functions that you need to execute once we get to the browser. And here is some serialized scope information for those functions. Okay, then the browser loads, it gets that bootstrap. We've automatically just bundled the appropriate functions and it executes them. And so instead of doing this like re-render dance, Marko guarantees that your components never re-render even across the transition from server to browser, which means that time to interactive is a bunch faster, and we're just overall doing less work during hydration on top of this whole sending a whole bunch less code. So those are really the two pillars of our performance side of things.
No, that's really cool to hear. And I mean, some of that stuff will sound familiar to some people because it's almost like making an isomorphic version of some of the philosophy that we had with Solid, where components run only once, except this time it's on the server and on the client. And the reason you can do this is really similar idea. It's the knowledge of the reactive graph. And I think that's really powerful here. But before we're going to demo this in a minute and just kind of play around with it. But before that, there's going to be this inevitable comparison to Qwik. And actually, as you guys know, I had Mishko on 2 weeks ago, and he kind of came up with this list of things that he felt were essential. And I mean, these are important pieces of the puzzle, and they're definitely essential for the solution that Qwik has done, like to make it resumable and progressive. Although we're talking about resumable and partial instead of maybe necessarily progressive. Does that change this list at all in terms of what needs to happen? Does it change any kind of the rules here, or how do you guys feel about this?
Yeah, I mean, when I was looking at this list, when you guys were going through it, it's like, yeah, there's some of these things that feel a little Qwik specific, but there is like the overwhelming majority of these things are applicable to sort of both solves, which is cool. I think we're working on, sort of similar problems. But like, as you said, one of the things that we aren't doing out of the box is this whole like progressive hydration. We still will have like async and lazy hydration and all that stuff. But anyway, so I think it's probably makes sense to just go through the list real quick. Breaking up code into chunks. I think comparing it to Qwik, Qwik is breaking things up based off of those, $ functions essentially, and organizing your code that way. The Marko compiler automatically breaks up your code based off of its like actual dependencies, which is going to be a bit smaller than what Qwik is able to do, right? Qwik is going to send a template when it needs to re-render. Marko is going to send just the expressions that are related to the actual change or state that you updated. So that's one difference there. No centralized bootstrap. That's something that Marko has, not had pretty much since the beginning. With partial hydration, you don't need centralized bootstrap.
Or pretty much any partial hydration.
Yeah, so any partially hydration. So yeah, we've got that. Serializing event handlers is important. Like I said in my explanation of resumability, we actually need the ability for the server to say, hey, here's some functions that I need you to serialize and execute. And so the way that kind of works in our solution is all of these functions that we know are possible to make it to the browser essentially get their own ID, and the server knows what those IDs are. And so we can say, like, when we're outputting we have a custom serializer, and when we're serializing stuff, we'll be like, okay, this is a function and its ID is this, and this is what its scope is. So yeah, that's definitely something you have to solve. And then restoring app state, definitely, if you want to continue where the server left off. And validating on state change, that comes back to the reactive system, right? So yeah, definitely out of order rendering is important, but I don't know that it's necessarily like critical to it.
because the key to the out of order rendering, the importance there is because that's when you want to break up stuff in terms of like when it loads in the browser. Like that's the progressive part. Like, can you load something further down the tree rather than higher up the tree? But if you one of the key differences here with the partial hydration mentality is if you know something will never run in the client, like if you just know that 100%, you've already eliminated such a majority of the code that, like, we've seen this at eBay where, it's easy, like pages vary from like 60 to 80% code reduction. And with these new optimizations, we might even be able to eke out another 5 to 10% on in some of those cases. So it does put less pressure on this. This is important if you're unclear, like stuff could be client side. So once you get into that, like the stateful stuff, out of order is basically the key to being able to load stateful stuff, break it apart further. But if you're not as worried about that, then this might not be as important. Okay.
Right. And I think this is a key differentiator between Qwik and what Marko is doing, because Qwik doesn't really know what server only. They have to assume that any code could potentially be loaded in the browser. And so they get around that by essentially lazy loading everything at every step of the way. So the difference with Marko is we, at compile time, determine what all of the things that could possibly update in the browser is. And so you're getting a much smaller subset of things. Like the JavaScript bundle is just way smaller right out of the gate, because we know there's so much that doesn't need to be sent to the browser.
And this rule is probably one of the most restrictive ones too, because this is the reason why there's no render props, or you have to eagerly evaluate. It's funny, it's interesting because Marko does analyze that, right? When it can tell when something is a render prop or when it's static, so it can make a call. So Marko still breaks things out that way if it's able to, but it doesn't force the developer to write their code that way, right?
Right. Yeah, and again, it's like aligning with our goals. We don't want to have necessarily this like crippled language that you can't do X, Y, or Z in. We really want to have a language that's like, wow, this feels like I'm writing a SPA, and these optimizations just happen without, having to think about it. And so, yeah, that's kind of a mentality difference. And in general, I would say, as far as this out of order rendering thing goes, with Marko, because we're able to make the bundles so small, I think it probably makes more sense to move the control over when and how things get loaded into explicit user land.
That's a philosophical difference. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, if you're already at the point where you're splitting hairs as far as bundle size goes, like, Misko said, like, make 20 KB bundles and all that stuff. It's like, okay, well, if our bundles are on average going to be 20 KB because we're sending so little, it's like, okay, well, is there really a point in splitting it out?
The biggest app, I suppose. Like
right.
We saw at Google. I mean, I believe there are real apps out there that are in that state. But interestingly enough, maybe not even in large-scale e-commerce. I mean, even in eBay's use case, we might not even necessarily hit that scale.
Right. And so I think that it is like we're going to have the application basically split up so much that it's going to be simpler to just be like, okay, this section I'm going to hydrate independently and lazy load this section, which is going to, when we get into the router, we can talk more about what that kind of looks like. But essentially, I think it's going to be small enough that it's going to be easier for the developer to reason about, like, yeah, this section could be loaded async. I know it's a bit expensive in my profiling or whatever, but the default that Marko is going to give you is a app that is literally only the things that are necessary for the browser, right? Whereas again, Qwik by default assumes that everything could make it to the browser, and it tries to lazy load stuff. So
right.
It's a difference of mentality there.
And that probably affects a couple more here. Right? We have observing side effects, which I think is still just reactivity. And then idealizing bundles, right? That's a big part of the Qwik solution because it's so mix and match. And it's kind of cool because using those analytics lets them kind of shape it per the network or for the device. Like depending on what the end user has, you have a little bit more play. But I'm gathering because of partial hydration, there's just less pressure there.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the way I would see it. I'm not going to say that like some applications would be better loaded through, this analysis and all that, or like analyzing your analytics and putting that into your build system and all that stuff. It's just in general, we're taking a different approach in that we know a certain amount of stuff doesn't need to be there. And so we're just working with a smaller problem, really. And we can still give developers the tools to be able to split stuff up on top of that. And maybe in the future, it makes sense to, automate some aspects of it. But in general, there's different challenges that come up when you start automating lazy loading of everything, right? Because a lot of it comes down to intent, and your analytics is probably a good measure for it, but like that's still not going to be perfect for necessarily every user, right? Like if I go and interact with some infrequently used thing, and it's like, okay, now I've got a bunch of jank because that wasn't bundled because of the analytics, because of how other people use the application. It's like, yeah, it's not a guaranteed win, right? It's not an absolute win. Whereas with partial hydration and, just looking at it from stuff that only needs to make it to the browser, that is just a straight up, there's no point to have sent that code, right? And the user experience isn't made better by having that code there eagerly.
That's a good point. Yeah, partial hydration is like an absolute optimization. Like regardless of scenario, 100% this code isn't going to the browser. So 100% no one needs to pay that cost, and 100% that you've made that JavaScript smaller. So yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, that varies with the degree of dynamicism. Like something that would be a single page app that's like dynamic all over the place, maybe can't partially hydrate as much. But
right.
For a lot of things, especially like e-commerce and stuff, 90% of your page is static. Like,
right.
That's
so
cool.
The other thing that I would add to that, and Qwik and what Qwik is doing, I think is super interesting. And I think there's going to certainly be use cases where this level of granularity is maybe not quite this level of granularity, but having the ability to go this granular is going to be useful. But so one of the things that having the compiler analysis that does for us on, again, an absolute level is also on the hydration data that we're sending, right? Because Qwik is sending, it could potentially load any component on the page, even those components that won't load necessarily. And I'm sure you could write your app in such a way that this is not the case, but you're going to need to send data for things that maybe it doesn't make sense for data to be sent for, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. This is the only reason I'm pulling this example out again, because
Right.
This is the whole reason this is so quick, is because the Marko page is literally half the size of the remix page, like the HTML is, because we don't serialize the data in this scenario, because we know that these comments never need to come to the browser, even though I've shown this demo a billion times. You can go in here and you can shrink these comments and interact with them, but we know because of the type of interaction, you never need to serialize this data. And that knowledge only comes from knowing what's exactly on the server and what's—
To be fair, because the way that is accomplished in Marko 5 is not something that's really, magic of the compiler, right? Like the original Hacker News demo that we had actually sent all the comments, right? And we refactored it so that the components were split such that the comments were actually like content that were passed to a stateful component, right?
Right. Yeah, and reaction components can
and so
have the same optimization too, right? It's like kind of same idea of just using the
yeah. So it should be possible to do something like that with server components. I'm not totally convinced because of the way that the diffing algorithm would have to handle that actually will be the case when it comes out, but we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah.
But something like Qwik could do the same sort of thing, that they could write their components in such a way that that data doesn't get sent.
Well,
whereas with Marko 6, the analysis will actually take care of this for you.
And at a
right.
Yeah.
So
I
you
think
could write, we actually had to go in and like change the way that we were writing the components in order to have it hydrate more efficiently. Whereas Marko 6 is going to be able to do, like, at least in this case, be able to do that for you automatically.
That's really cool. And this all just lends to developer experience, which is that last point. The reason you do all this stuff is because you don't want to sacrifice on that developer experience. That's why relying on the compiler is a big part of it. And we've seen that be a success story in other frameworks. Svelte is notorious for its the kind of developer experience, and it's part of relying on that compiler. I'm excited when we actually look at Marko here, because there's a lot of similarities to Svelte, not maybe in syntax necessarily, but in the way the reactive system works. Except Marko's kind of taken that reactive, compiled reactive approach and made it work cross templates and stuff. I'm really excited to dig into it. So maybe is it time to kind of pull out the demo and kind of see what we're dealing with, so to speak. Yeah, no, it is definitely really cool stuff, right? Yeah, no, definitely. V6 is really cool. V4 in 2017 was really cool too. We've seen a lot of other solutions like, do parts of it, right? Like Astro does, a bit of that same kind of tree inclusion, but it doesn't. The data stuff, I'm not sure if they actually build that in. And React Server components have elements of it, and streaming is another one of the big things that Marko pioneered. And we're seeing a lot of different libraries kind of go in now and add a lot of those features. I mean, I keep this around, and I've shown everyone on the stream before, but this was just one of my kind of favorite old quotes here. If I can find it again in my bookmarks, but it was like Marko's, even if it hasn't directly influenced it, it's had kind of an impact in terms of the way solutions are going and where things are heading. So I'm really excited because Marko 6, this is talking about like Marko 4 or 5. Marko 6 is taking this even further. Talking to developers, you guys plan on extending the docs? I'm just going to throw this out here. I know the small team, it's quite difficult to throw out high-level concepts marked from the docs. Yeah, to be fair, there's a reason for this. We've been working on Marko 6 for like 2 years, and it was like, do you go back and like, we did clean up the docs around the time when I first started. It kind of came in because it was kind of like, what's going on? That Fastify integration doesn't work anymore. But we would like to do more here, and I think part of it is like it's changing again with Marko 6, so it didn't make a ton of sense. But you're right, we've been selling it. The new homepage redesign, and that you can see you can see kind of some of the concepts, but we don't really mechanically explain it too much, right? We've got this great streaming example, on the homepage and the partial hydration story, but connecting to the code is a bit more effort. And I expect with post 6, we're going to kind of focus on this again. The truth of the matter is most of the stuff came out around Marko 4, and to be fair, stuff hasn't changed a ton on that side. So maybe the docs are never that good. They're more on the syntax. But I feel like when we went to go do it again, we're like, it's so hard when something big is coming around the corner. And I feel like that was similar with React. They were sitting there and like, okay, we know we need to rewrite the docs. And they worked on the beta docs, and Rachel Neighbors did a great job with that before she left. But essentially, they knew, like with hooks and everything, like everything's just around the corner. You keep on pushing it off because it's a lot of work, especially for a small team. And the next great thing is right around the corner, and things are getting closer now. So yeah, this will be a big focus, especially as we get Marko 6 beta out, hopefully sometime this summer.
Yeah, there's definitely that tension there. Like I want to go back and rewrite things, but I want to use like the tags API, that's really just kind of in preview right now. So I don't think that makes sense for the main docs, but like that's what I would want to use to kind of explain some of these concepts and everything. So
and there's a few things that's like a few places where like there's a split component mechanism where you can opt out of sending a template to the browser and stuff like that. But like things like that, these optimizations just go away. Like there's several parts of the docs that's highlighting optimizations that are going to be irrelevant because of the changes that we're making. And part of the reason we made those changes is because we know not everyone's reading the docs, or not everyone's following those best practices, or sometimes they're hard to do. And I think this does come back to the DX side of things, because, essentially, if performance is an issue, usually the way to resolve performance ends up impacting DX. Like, I think of React's hooks, actually, like, the effects and memoizing and like all that stuff. The fact that you have to think about that and the dependencies arrays and like all that stuff partially comes down to performance, and like, back before, like, should component update and all that stuff kind of comes down to performance. But as soon as you have a system where performance is not an issue, you can usually make the API a lot simpler as well. And I think Solid's actually a good example of that, right? Because it's got this reactive system that makes a lot of sense, and because it's performant, like, you don't have to think about memos and stuff as much. And also, there's lots of nice characteristics of being performance first, especially when it aligns with the DX. And that's kind of what we're trying to do. So there's a number of reasons we haven't tackled the docs, but it is something that we're going to obviously have to think through a lot of.
I mean, and to be fair, we have lots of examples. If people use the CLI, I mean, it is, maybe I should throw this back on the screen for just a moment, but if you go in and go to the get started and follow kind of the like installation guide or whatever, like the Marko create, we have lots of examples in there, from Cloudflare deploys to do MVC apps and whatnot. So there are a ton of examples in the examples repo to play with different types of integrations. So docs need work, but there are things to reference. But let's move on. Let's move on to demo this stuff. I think it'd be really cool to take a look at that. So I don't know, Michael, if you want to share your screen, we can kind of start looking at this stuff.
All right.
Okay, I'm going to add that in. Here we go.
All right, so this is our playground, and I've modified it so that we're able to see the compiled output from V6. We're still in an alpha phase. I do want to, or pre-alpha phase actually. I do want to stress that. And so not every feature is like currently handled by the compiler yet, but for those that aren't, we can talk a little bit about how it's going to work, and I could maybe even pull up some of the hand compiled examples if that would be useful. But so this is the button. You click it, the number goes up.
Can we talk about the tags API for a second? Because
we can talk about the tags API. I think that would be good.
Because you just showed this code example, and I'm looking on the screen, and some people might go, "This is kind of alien," but the whole concept here, right, is that everything's a tag, right?
Everything's a tag, and so that has kind of been one of our like driving principles of the tags API, and really whatever the API for Marko 6 was going to be. We wanted you to be able to build upon the primitives in a way that allowed you to expose APIs similar to what the primitives themselves exposed. And I don't know if that makes total sense, just like
what's the term?
Saying that, but
potent, is that the term? It's when like it's possible to recreate any of the primitives. You can recreate any of the base primitives.
Right, like if I want to create my own, let's say call it mylet, right? Like this is kind of stupid, but like we have the ability to return a bound value here. I can't type. And then I can say mylet. Probably should receive that value there. So that
attributes is the equivalent to props, and in so it's like
so we have this concept of a default attribute, and that's just kind of an unnamed attribute that comes through as default, which does mean that you have to alias it. We're hoping that that actually discourages the use of it for cases where you shouldn't be doing it, because in most cases we would recommend that you do name these, but it would be kind of, I think, annoying if like your let made you assign like value equals or initial equals for like every usage, when this is going to be such a common tag.
Well, this just
But yeah, but this just works. Like I've created basically just a wrapper around the let tag. But so, I mean, this means I could do a lot more in here. I could sync this to local storage. I could have this be an animated value. You know, I set to 1, and I could have it like go by tenths. So you see, so 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4 up until 2, right?
This is already pretty cool, because this is like React hooks, and I know because internally, but this is like the compiler and stuff is very similar to Svelte, but you just made a composable hook. This is something that's you can't do in Svelte on the compiler. You have to bring in like Svelte stores. You just simply just pulled it out of the file and presto.
Right, and that's something that we there's trade-offs there, right? And this is we're using a compiler-based reactive system, and what that means is that our reactive system can't really leave the Marko tags, right? Like with Solid, your reactive system isn't really bound to the components. The components work off the reactive system, but like you can just like outside of a component just create a signal, right, and then use it. And Svelte's and the API that they have set up, you kind of feel that limitation, because if you wanted to create an animated value like this, you can no longer use like just the let in the script tag, right? Like you can't create your own let. You do have to reach out to stores, and the stores are just kind of like runtime, you know, reactivity. But the tags API is set up in such a way that, like, yes, you can't break this out into JavaScript land. You like still have to, you know, write a Marko tag, but you can actually break out that logic and compose these behaviors as you're building components. And so,
and you can still import JavaScript too, right? Like,
yeah, you can still import JavaScript. Yeah, if I wanted to. This is stupid, but
yeah, it's just regular JavaScript imports there.
Right.
I go create that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a few interesting things about all of this coming from a tag, because I mean, really one of the goals for Marko is to make all of this describable in a language that feels like it's built on top of HTML. Like we want you to be able to take some HTML and like add some state to it right there, right where it's needed, right? So like if you have, you know, sort of like a list or something like that, and you're going through and you decide that you want to make that list into an accordion, you can add state right inside the for loop that you're using to render your list and like toggle each thing. So you can just put it right where it's needed. And then obviously that makes it, since everything's kind of co-located or able to be co-located, it makes it easier to refactor things, throw them out into separate files. Yeah. And yeah, like here, you know, this is actually pretty interesting because Michael has essentially, in a for loop, created a whole bunch of independent states that are tied to the for loop iteration, right? Like any other framework, pretty much is going to have like forced you into making a new component for something like this.
I mean,
so the example that Michael's showing is a bit contrived, and so I hope that it's coming across where this could be useful. But like really, the cases where you're gonna run into stuff like this is like, I've got some existing markup. I want to add some new functionality to it. How can I work with the markup that I have? Is your framework going to cause you to have to refactor before you can actually like, you know, add state, because, you know, state has to be at the top level in this use hook or something like that. With Marko, we want to make it so you can just, you know, put these tags, and, you know, we're only showing the let tag and this like my let that just reflects the let tag. But these tags are a lot like hooks in other frameworks, except they're a little bit more powerful, and they're more powerful in a a couple ways. One of them is, that they are tree aware, right? Like you can put this anywhere in the tree and it's just going to work fine. If it's under an if statement, that's fine. Which means you can do the collocation and all that stuff. But it also means that you can do stuff like have a tag that tells you whether or not the element that tag is in the viewport and stuff like that, without having to pass around anything. And there was one other thing I was going to bring up that I'm now blanking on. But yeah, the collocation. And it makes it really easy to not just extract out really behaviors like hooks in many frameworks allow you to do, but it also allows you to extract out markup and behaviors put together, right? Because it's all just in the template. So like if you have a dialogue component that wants to also expose in a hook-like way some state about the dialogue, like that's totally possible and really easy. You don't have to.
Yeah, you had a good example actually that you mentioned to me earlier, and people here might be familiar with that example because we did Remix on stream, but the forms in Remix actually were a good example, weren't they?
Yeah, so like in Remix, they've got essentially APIs for like use form data, and then they've also got a component that's like capital F form, right? And these are kind of separated because presumably you want to be able to access the form data anywhere, but it is still tied to this form. So it'd be kind of nice if you could, say this is the form data from this form that I'm writing. And with the tags API, you can literally just have your, capital F form with a tag variable after it that's giving you the current form data. And so you can express it all from one place. Which just makes it easier to write. You're not having to, I add a new form to the page. Okay, that means that I have to put the form here and I have to scroll to the top of my function and add a use form, whatever. And so now I've got two forms on the page. So I've got two use form things. And if I want to extract out one of those forms, it's the whole story that many people have probably seen with, Dan's original thing on hooks. It's like, how many places do I have to go into the code to extract something out into a new component or refactor it or whatever? How many lines am I touching to add functionality? And with this API, essentially, we've been trying to make it so that is very few lines, because everything is able to be essentially put into your template. And so you're not having to repeat things like, conditions or the structure or hoist things in weird ways, just so you have access to a variable. The tag variables are just there in your markup.
Yeah, because like even in this example, you could start building this giant component and adding more and more functionality. And then at some point in the future, be like, oh, I want to extract that out. And then like just cut it out. And there's like no imports or anything you have to worry about here. You just like snatch, cut it, paste it, which is really quite cool. I know that the imports from the helper was from the other thing. I mean, yes, you killed that for me because of that one thing. Although maybe imports, like if we want to take it all the way, we could probably nest the imports. But essentially, you can kind of already see that with this co-location, you just this frees up the editing side. They said almost earlier because they're treading carefully a little bit because they know that I'd interrupt and go, you can do that in solid. But that's because on the technical side, there's nothing mechanical that stops you from nesting state in solid because the components are nothing. They're just function calls.
Right.
And
I mean, it really comes down to reactivity and whether or not it's tied to the component level, right? And in a lot of frameworks, React and Svelte, it definitely is. Vue, I'm not totally clear on because it's a fine-grained reactive system feeding into components. But then Solid, right? Like the reactive system is kind of outside the components, and like the for component creates a new root that the reactive values created under that root are assigned to. So you can do this in Solid, and actually because it uses like a renderer prop, you're already in JavaScript land, so it's not so bad to do that. It's a little bit awkward if you wanted to do like this under an if in Solid, because you'd need to
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because when you look at this, it's like some frameworks just couldn't represent something like this, and other frameworks could represent something like this. But I think one of the things that I appreciate about the tags API is that not only can you represent this, but also it doesn't require you having to touch multiple parts of the file, right? Like even in Solid, if you were to just try and create a signal inside some random div or something like that, Like you could maybe put an iffy in there, and then you're also going to have to go and put like a let somewhere like above so that you have the variable. Like it's just not something that's representable in JavaScript.
Right? The JSX doesn't.
Exactly. Yeah. So like part of our goal is making it so that these primitives that we bring into what is the Marko language make sense for a templating language. And one of those things here is that the tag variables, they can actually be hoisted. So like if you have a div, so I guess we haven't shown this, but one of the ways, or one of the things you probably have to do is get, a ref to some element. And so any native element gives you a tag variable that gives you its ref. So you on this button, you could go /btn and you would have a JavaScript variable that is a ref to that button. And you can add an effect that reads that ref, but the effect could be, anywhere in the template. It's automatically going to get hoisted because, we don't want you to have to think about the way that things are placed in the template to be able to use these variables. And there's stuff in place to handle like conflicts and all that stuff. But in general, we're trying to approach it from the perspective of what is the most useful from a templating language in terms of the scoping, in terms of how you can define variables and where they can be defined and all of that stuff. So having the language gives us a little bit of a superpower there.
Yeah, for sure. And that's the whole thing. Even if, as I said, Solid has the mechanical ability to do JSX is not suitable for this. Like basically this is part of the power here and part of the reason the templating language is this templating language. Some people kind of look, sometimes they're like, what's going on here? But everything is built with purpose, and I've looked at a lot of SFC templates languages. You all have. It's one of the only ones that has it has 95% of the flexibility of JSX. Like there's a couple little bits, but where the restrictions are makes it more animalizable for the hydration case. And when you add this ability with the tag variables in here, it actually opens up a type of co-location that goes beyond, right? We saw the class components to hooks, where the colors went together, like in that old graphic. And I've talked about this before. This is like the next step, because even with hooks, stuff is still in 2 locations. And now we're basically we've merged it into 1. We lost Michael there for a second. Let's see if can we get Michael back. Hey, Michael.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, your screen disappeared, so I don't know if you're.
Oh, I can switch back to sharing if that's.
Yeah. Yeah, let's see if we can get back to it, because you pulled up to do MVC, and I think that's a demo that people probably want to see.
Yeah, the reason I had pulled this up, I don't know if we want to hop over here yet, but like I felt like, probably you don't want to write the entire to-do MVC app in one file, but that's what we're kind of looking at here.
It's not bad here. It's 78 lines of code for the to-do MVC app. That's pretty terse.
We're missing a little bit of functionality because this is the version that doesn't have the editing. But I thought this was a pretty reasonable use of, even though it's not like under a for loop or in a different context or anything, being able to have this filter down here in the footer, because it's just used, by the footer to say there's 2 items left, and then we want to set it to those 2 items when we click clear. That's pretty nice that, I'm not forced to hoist this up to the top level, like where the to-dos themselves are. Right, like I can put it closer to where it's actually used. That's all.
Yeah, exactly. Show here. What's cool about this? One of the challenges. We've seen single file component files, and it's funny because if you tie the change management to the single file components, you don't want to break out a new file all the time, right? Like us React users know, like I don't say us, but also like Solid users know, like it's nice to be able to like have all the functions
right
sometimes and kind of play around with ideas and refactor. And Marko has a macro tag, which has done that forever. But I think it's actually interesting in this version, but you're just like, well, yeah, sure, you can do the macro, but forget the macro even yet. Let's just build this out where it makes sense. We're like, we got some state down here. We'll just put some state down here. And then we're like, oh, this is too much. Then we'll cut it out. And you could probably literally highlight that section and move it into a separate file at that point.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, I've never seen editing like this in any JavaScript framework.
Yeah, especially with single file components, right? Because typically single file component, it's like, we're going to break up your styles. We're going to break up your behavior. We're going to break up, you know, the templating logic, but having it all be able to be defined, like you can define the styles anywhere. You can like write a style tag. You can define your behaviors anywhere. You can have the let, the const effects, like they can be right where they're used. And that just makes so many things easier. Like, you know, a simple case is you've got something, it's conditional on the screen. And when it's visible, you want to have an effect that runs that, you know, does something. Maybe it runs an animation or whatever. If you want to have a conditional effect in a lot of frameworks, you've got to make another component, right? And in React, and Solid, that's, you know, fairly simple because you can go and create another function. Like at least it's in the same file, right? But with the tags API, not only can you do it in the same file, but you can just do it right there. You don't have to go and like hoist something out and like think about what this refactor is going to look like, what variables I have to move and all that stuff, right? Like you can just put an effect right next to where it's necessary, right? And when that if statement gets removed, the effect gets cleaned up. When the if statement comes back, the effect runs again, right?
Cool. Yeah. So can we do something concrete here, because we've been kind of nailing this home, and I think no one said anything yet in the comments. I don't know if people are just kind of going, okay. But let's, like, this is a bit of a departure, you know, from what people are used to. So, you know, it takes a little bit. But yeah, can we do something a little bit more concrete?
Yeah, I think maybe I could share my screen for a second, and unless Michael had something to go into.
No, I mean, I'm just kind of showing what Brian was talking about, or you were talking about.
Yeah. Okay. Let me take over for a sec if that's easy.
You just share it and I'll swap it in.
Yeah. Okay. Is that working?
Yeah. Here you go, Dylan.
Yeah. So, I mean, here is just some basic markup. Essentially, we've got a const that is an array of items that are in a cart. We've got a UL. We're iterating over the items, displaying a title, and then a description, right? And so this is actually, I kind of brought up a bit earlier, like, you know, you're iterating over a list. Now you've got a requirement. How do we make it so that each item in this list is toggleable? Like we want to turn this into an accordion, right? We don't want to see, we only want to see iPhone 13 and MacBook Pro here. And then we want to be able to expand it to show the other stuff. So like I said, in a lot of frameworks, it's going to cause you to have to think about, okay, well, now I've got to go and build my item component. Now I've got to create the item.jsx or whatever and all that stuff. Or I can do it, you know, in a function that's in the same file if it's JSX, which is not as bad. But with Marko, we can literally go in here and just be like, okay, is this thing closed? So we're going to default it to false. And then we want to toggle it when we click this guy. So we'll just do, you know, closed equals not closed. And then we're just going to make it so that this guy is hidden if it's not closed, right? And so there it is. Like I added the functionality right here. And the great thing about this is now I want to go and extract this out. Like I can just take this section, move it into a file. I have to add like an attribute to receive, you know, the item, because I'm going to have like, essentially I could refactor this into, you know, item equals item kind of thing or whatever. But it's like item, which is, you know, great. But anyways, the key is that I didn't touch anything else here, right? Like I didn't have to jump around this file and be like, okay, I'm going to copy this piece of state from here, and I'm going to copy, you know, X from here and whatever. And like, you could have an effect that's like doing something like closing the tab after a certain amount of time. Like you could put the effect right here as well, right? And that's super nice as far as, you know, I'm writing this. I know exactly what needs to happen. I don't have to think about refactoring it before I finish my job, right? And in this case, it's such simple logic that we don't even need to refactor it, right? It like there's no reason for this to require multiple components or multiple functions even. Now, if it was something that was reused across multiple templates, then sure, yeah, extract it out into another Marko file. Or if it's something that's just like overwhelmingly large, or you want to test it independently, or like some valid reason to extract it out into another file, then that's great. But we don't have to do that. In this case, it doesn't make sense, right? So yeah, hopefully that hammers home that piece. And then I just threw up like a couple examples that maybe illustrate some of the points. Yeah. So like, you know, here I have a component that's basically inserting a node just so that I can get a reference to it, so that I can give the height and width of the current container. So like here, and I could have a different API. There's a million ways to like implement this. But I've just got this quick little tag that's like, hey, give me the height and width of the container that I'm in. This div happens to be 110 by whatever right now, and if I add a few breakpoints to that, it gets a little bit larger. Like it's super easy to do that stuff, and I'm able to have it co-located, right? So I can again just extract that out, and then to like a little bit more of a complex example.
Can we go back to that for 1 second? I just appreciate that example for a second, because if I understand it, this is kind of like, you think it's like a kind of a hook, but you're actually using a ref in order to find the size of the parent. So there's actually DOM elements in this hook.
Like this thing's rendering a kind like a WBR, which is like a word break, like nothing element. It could be a no script, could be a comment, could be whatever, but I just did a WBR there. Just so that it can put something in the DOM, just so that it can get a reference to the current location that we're at in the DOM, so that it can return the height and width. And like another example you could think of with this is, an element that's like, am I in the viewport, right? So like I could build something, I'm not going to build it right now, but we could have something like intersection in viewport, right? And we could just have that right here. It can know, okay, is this element in the viewport? Because it can be tree aware, like that's super easy. And then we can just have an if statement here that's like, if we're in the viewport, then we're gonna do something crazy. We could actually run some JavaScript, right? Like we could run an effect here, and we have an effect that executes whenever we're in the viewport, or we could render something whenever we're in the viewport, right? So it's super, super powerful to be able to co-locate what is effectively hooks right into the markup, because it gives you these kinds of superpowers, but also just because it's easier to refactor and like work on existing code and that kind of stuff.
Okay, this came up and we have to address it because this is everyone's favorite. Why the slash? Like, why do tag variables have a slash? Why can't we just use a space? And this actually is a bit more obvious with a different example, but go for it.
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, this is probably 3 years ago or more, probably more. We realized we needed something like tag variables in the language, and that's what these are. They're tag variables, and the right-hand side is a JavaScript expression, right? So like if I have an object here and I'm like destructuring, that's fine. Although lets can't be destructured because they're signals and whatever. But like essentially the left-hand side here is just any JavaScript expression. So we knew we needed something like that. Now this symbol, so tricky. Obviously it can't be a space because now we're in attribute land,
right? It could be any attribute. You could have more attributes on it. Like you could have close, false, key equals. Like just because it has a slash doesn't mean that you can't have other attributes after it.
Yeah, and so it's tricky. I mean, there's not a lot of, like, it could have been exclamation mark, it could have been whatever. And so we kind of landed on slash. It seemed like the least off-putting. I think it's one of those things where, once you're using it for a little bit, like it's just gone. Like it's just a syntax, the power of it ends up shining above.
We all kind of hated it. I think at the beginning we were like, there's no good choice here. Let's just put slash here. Maybe we'll come up with something better. And it's one of those things that it's like, it's a character. Like it's gotten to the point now, because we've been looking at this, code every day for probably a year now, since we, decided that it was going to be slash, that it's like, it just seems normal. This, and one of the things Dylan said, which I think is true, is you can make things like correct and consistent, not correct. You can make things consistent, or you can become more familiar with things, but you can't like make something more consistent without like changing it. Right. Yeah, I'm totally messing up your quote. Do you want to say it better?
Oh boy. I think I need more coffee as well, but what was it? Yeah, essentially, like if you've got a consistent system, but it's unfamiliar, you can learn it and appreciate the consistency of it, right? But if you've got this, inconsistent system, even if you know it, you hate it. And that inconsistent system is JavaScript, basically. I'm just kidding. But, essentially, we're trying to make it so that this is a language that is super consistent, and that in the user land side of things, you can do all of the stuff that we're exposing through the language. And then there's also things we're considering, like I said before, this is a language. What is it? When should you be able to see this variable? When does it make sense? Like this. So this is the tag parameter syntax. So basically, there's two ways to get data out of a tag. You can pass data into the body of the tag, or you can expose data out of the tag so it becomes available, like, outside of the scope. And so those are two scoping mechanisms that we realized were like necessary to implement some of the things that people are doing in other frameworks. But like in general, they also are easier to write than in other frameworks. And you don't have limitations of like, like think about refs. I think refs are, in general, in every framework, are kind of annoying. Like you have to go, okay, I'm going to scroll to the top of this function. I've got this list of all these hooks, and I've got, a few other refs, and I'll put this one in here, and maybe I'll sort it right there. And then I'm going to pass that down, and we're going to like pass it to this element that's in the markup here. No, we have it so that tags can expose variables, and it just so happens that the native tags expose a variable that is their reference. And so it's just a lot easier to, the slash though, everyone is pointing out.
This is one of those things in Solid too. Like technically, you don't need refs in Solid, right? Like
you need a let somewhere.
You do need a let somewhere. That is true.
Yeah. I mean, but the thing with the it's important to differentiate. We didn't focus on the for loop and these pipes around it, but it's basically like a render prop. It's like a function scope. So it is the children, where the slash is for siblings. So this is just kind of it's important that we need both syntaxes. But if you don't want to see what this looks like in Svelte or Vue. It is nasty. I actually put a Twitter tweet. I tried to find it just now, but I wasn't going to find it fast enough. But like, there's a reason, I make a big deal about JSX and composability, because you could literally make that for my for and follow the same thing. And JSX is the same way. Like, props on that. But when you go to a lot of template DSLs, you don't get to turn hashtag each into hashtag paginated list. You have to go to a completely different thing, if you want to make it, people just don't do it in those frameworks, because if you want to make it a different thing, it's nasty. They use attributes with like namespaces for each thing, like bind : this or let : this. And it just pollutes the whole thing, and it changes the semantics of attributes. What Marko has done here is invent a couple syntaxes for purpose, but actually kept the semantic meaning of existing things instead of trying to overload them. So, this is one of those funny things where people are like, oh, it's just HTML. It kind of is annoying for me when I hear that, because it isn't just HTML when you use HTML attributes to change the semantics of how it executes. And then you're like, oh, but it looks like HTML. Like, people can argue about that, but like, this stuff all compiles to JavaScript anyways, so it isn't just HTML. But I mean,
Marko is like a declarative, reactive framework for building trees, and like it's got the control flow in it and all that stuff. I think going back to the fact that the for tag is something you can build in userland. Like you can have a paginated, like Ryan said, you can have a paginated for, where you're like, obviously I'd have to change the closing there. Closing's optional in Marko, but I could have a paginated for where it's like limit 5. It's like show 5 at a time, right? And look at how little code I had to change to do that. Now, if I was in Svelte or something similar, I'm going to have to go from my fancy little each thing to something that you don't want to show your children.
Yeah,
I'm just kidding.
It is nasty doing those kind of projections in those.
Yeah. So in a way, part of the reason, and I don't know if it was highlighted at the beginning, that we wanted to make it so that all of our core tags use the same syntax as something you can build yourself, is to kind of keep us honest. Let's make that syntax nice, and let's make it easy when people decide to add functionality to these core tags, which is super common for there's tons of examples, and then there's for and the paginated things. Like there's lots of types of experiences or tags that you'd want to build that iterate over stuff. And so, yeah, that's partly one of our design goals of the language, is to make it so that it's like very easy to go from A to B.
Yeah. You just stop seeing it after a while because it just your brain connects the dots. Sorry, I'm just talking to this comment.
Yeah.
So, where do we want to go to next? Do we have a couple more examples? Did we want to talk about getting more into the hydration story and more into the compiler? People have been pretty quiet. I think they're just taking this in because it's been pretty big. It's a big difference in syntax and developer experience, but that's not the only reason we're doing this. Obviously, it's a big part of it. We actually believe that this is incredible for the refactor story and the maintainability story. But this compiler and this reactivity have other benefits.
Yeah.
So, Dylan, do you have the branch that I sent you?
I do not. So it's probably going to make the most sense for you to share your screen.
Unless you have any more examples, Dylan. But
I mean, I didn't actually show this one, but it's kind of cool that you can just take, like I built a tween tag that just takes in some state, and you say like how long the thing should tween for. And, I'm printing out both the tween version and the actual version. And you can see like the actual state is updating immediately, and then the tween version's like catching up, right? And it's not that crazy to build that much code. Like I have, an effect that's doing a request animation frame, and it's returning the current tween value and all that stuff. But like you can abstract out some complex things. And now, this tag has the same benefits as the let tag. I can put it wherever it's needed, all the collocation, and all that stuff. So I just think it's cool. But yeah, we can go to Michael now.
Let me get Michael back on the screen here. You sharing something, Michael, for us?
Actually, I think I just stopped by accident. So let me.
But let's transition into this, because
it's
funny. People are really stoked about like the unique pieces of Marko, like the hydration and I did this kind of on purpose. I wanted to start here because I don't think people realize, because people like get hung up. There's a lot of value that comes from the compilation and comes from the syntax, even if people kind of are perhaps want to reject it at first. This is not just because we like weird symbols.
Yeah. Yeah, it's literally like, we're looking at common types of things that people are building. We're realizing that you're going to use a template to build those things. And how do we make the template able to express those things in a way that is easier than writing vanilla JavaScript? Like I know people initially when React first came out were like, oh, I have to use a map or I have to use a ternary to map stuff. And obviously we're used to that now, but Solid bringing back like a show tag and the mapping and all that stuff. It's like, being able to represent it as HTML is nice because it's a declarative way. You're not having to take this, JavaScript imperative escape hatch to get there at. I don't know.
So
interesting.
Let's see if we can get Michael's screen here.
So I'm back to. Are we seeing my screen now?
I think it's my screen.
Yeah, you have to share first, and then I share it. Michael.
Oh, it says that I'm sharing my screen.
I found it.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, so back to our basic button example, and we can play with this to see what happens. But so I'm gonna pull up the compiled output for Marko 6, and it's not a whole lot of code. So
can everyone see this? I want to make sure that the text is big enough. I know.
Yeah, maybe zoom in a little bit, Michael.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. So, because we've got this actually doesn't scroll.
Oh, okay, fine.
So
you could
I'm
expand
one
the
out.
view. You could.
Oh, I could do that. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I could do that.
This is our new Try It Online.
This is something I hacked together like in a couple nights, and then like 2 nights ago I added the Marko 6 output to it. So yeah, this still needs a little bit of work. We actually do have this kind of like hidden on the website. If you go to markojs.com/playground, you can get to it, but there's no links to it anywhere yet. anyways, so this is the like we said, we're breaking apart your template into like a bunch of little pieces. And that's so that we can do a number of things. One, it's what powers the fine-grained reactivity. It's all driven by the compiler. And then two, so that we can eliminate code in a more fine-grained way rather than just this component goes through the browser and this component stays on the server. So yeah, it's not a whole lot of code. So I'm going to walk through this counter example, and then we can start changing this code, and we'll point out some things in the compiled output. But so the first thing in here, besides the imports.
One more thing, Michael,
yeah.
just you can press hide at the bottom and it gets rid of that little StreamYard thing that's blocking.
Oh, I didn't realize you all could see that. Okay.
Yeah.
So the template here is the static parts of the HTML. And so in this case, it's the button element, and then this is a marker representing where the dynamic text is going to go. We also have this walks string, which is it's a little bit interesting, but if you look at like the compiled output for Solid or Svelte, or I guess those are probably the two big ones that do this kind of thing, that create the elements up front and then find them. You're actually like walking. Well, Svelte actually builds the tree manually. Solid does a similar cloning thing to what Marko's doing, but you guys do like a first child, and like actually like you have first child in the template in the compiled code, whereas what we're doing here is we're actually encoding instructions to actually go find this button and go find the text node. And so I'll actually decode this real quick just for fun. So the walker starts on the first element. This space represents a get. And so we're using a tree walker. The D represents a next. So that actually walks into the button, into its first child. This percent side represents a replace, saying we're going to replace this with a text node. And then this L represents like leave the button and go to the next sibling of the button. And so if this is the top level template, this actually doesn't ever get used, but this becomes important. We'll talk about components a little bit more later, but it does become important for that.
Yeah, this is probably one of the less interesting things of what's being compiled, but it is important to know that, we've extracted out the static content into the template string, and then we also have these walks. And so, this walk string is a little bit more dense than, next sibling, skip, whatever. And we have some codes in there to make it shorter and so on. But this also is skipped or not bundled when this component isn't necessary in the browser. Right. So that's why it's its own separate sort of export. And having it be a string also makes it so that it's easier to merge with other components and so on. But yeah, not a particularly interesting thing, but.
Right. And then apply is apply is just kind of a random verb that we've chosen, but the base apply function is what's used to apply like these static values in the template. So in this case, the initial value of 0 is the only static value in the template. So we have the static nodes up here, static values are in this apply. And then we have apply functions for every reactive value in the template as well. And so in this case, it's just apply count. And for both cases, so we don't have any static hydration logic in this case, but every value and also all the static values get split into an apply and a hydrate. And so in the apply case, and this is something that we actually aren't thrilled about. Defer that. But it will be optimized away. But this is binding this click handler, and this actually happens every time count changes, since the click handler actually is reading the value of count. Then we update the data node, and then we call hydrate count, which ensures that we have the click handler on the button. And then the click handler is right here. This actually gets hoisted out, and this is kind of one of the other interesting things. So we've closed over this value of count in the template, but we actually hoist pretty much every function out to the top level of the compiled output. So there really aren't like any closures that you can see in this template. And we are actually reading this value from an internal scope that is this template. It actually, the scopes actually span across templates, but you kind of operate on your subsection of the scope here. And so count is stored at 2. So when we need count, we read it. And then when we're updating count, we write to that offset of 2. And then the DOM nodes that are walked to are actually also stored in this scope. So that text node is stored at 1, and the button is stored at 0. So when you see these numbers, and then the event handler shouldn't need to be stored in that scope, but currently is. It's stored at 3.
Yeah, I think the kind of the simple walkthrough of what this is, and it isn't really showing that it's broken up by the sources, because in this case there's only one state, really, the count. But essentially all the apply functions are what needs to happen to render the function, right? So the default apply is saying, okay, if I'm rendering this from scratch, I'm calling this apply. Apply count is saying, oh, if count changes, I'm doing this stuff. But that is like essentially work the server can do. All of these other things like hydrate count, so there can be a hydrate for any state. You see in this case, there isn't a default hydrate because there isn't anything that doesn't have dependencies that needs to be hydrated. But anyways, so all the hydrate stuff is stuff that needs to run in the browser. So when the server is rendering this template, it's going to be like, okay, yeah, I know this. I rendered this thing. I know it's got a hydrate count. I'm going to call that. And so in this case, you can see when it calls that, it's going to register that click handler, which is exactly what we want to happen during the hydration process. So the interesting thing here is if we took this template, say it's at the top level, our compiler is going to know that, essentially half of this template is unnecessary in the browser, because the only little bit of re-rendering that can actually happen is in this apply count section, because when the click handler, is executed, which is one of those things that needs to be sent to the browser, then it's going to call apply count so that it can, update that text node that's there. That's the client side rendering, but everything else doesn't need to be sent to the browser. So in this case, that means, we're not sending that top level apply function. We're not sending the template, the walks, like all of those exports, none of that gets sent to the browser. And I mean, this is a component that looks like it's pretty much entirely reactive, and we've still been able to strip out half of the code, right? So you can imagine that becoming much more pronounced in real examples.
Yeah, just give me a second here, just to kind of iterate over it. Basically, when this first hydrates in the browser, it doesn't need to run anything but that hydrate function, right?
Right.
Essentially, the apply stuff doesn't run. Like the only thing we actually need is the hydrate. So it comes in and it goes, add the click handler, hydration done.
Right.
Then when someone clicks it, because the click handler is on it, it then calls apply count, as you see inside the click handler, and then it runs the code in here. And that means that that's all the code you need for the component when it's as you say, top level and not stateful outside, because essentially you just get to tree shake the rest of this.
Right. So we don't actually have the export in here, but what would happen if this was being used for hydration? This is all running in the browser, obviously, but if this were being used for hydration, we would export this and we would tree shake based on exports, right? So these exports would not be used. This one would be. And so we, yeah, I mean, and this isn't even like we get to rely on the, the bundlers to tree shake this for us. Like Rollup just, eliminates all this code for us, because from walking the one export that's used, we're like, okay, so this on-click is referenced, and then the supply count is referenced from that, and so like we're able to just get rid of the rest of this code. So that's kind of nice.
Yeah, and the other thing is, Michael pointed out that essentially there's this scope that is outside of your component here. Like there's all these numbers that are referencing things in a scope, and that's super intentional, because one of the things we need to be able to do is essentially say, okay, here are relevant things in the scope that is going to be necessary when we go to the browser, right? So in this case, let's think about what needs to happen when we run that event handler, right? So that on click, what does the browser need to have available to execute that? It actually needs to know what the current value of click is, because a ++ is really, count +1. So it's reading count. And so we know that count actually needs to be serialized in this case. So what the server would do is it would be like, okay, I'm going to serialize that count. It's at scope position 1. I know that's the only thing you need serialized. Maybe there's other stuff in here that's like const and stuff like that only makes it to the DOM nodes. It's not used in an effect or an event handler. Those just don't get serialized. So essentially, we're able to look at the template, look at the effects and event handlers, look at the things that are referenced in those scopes, and just mark those as being serialized. Whereas, if we were looking at Qwik, like we talked about before, it's going to be like, oh, this is a section that could maybe re-render. And so, well, it doesn't know that it can maybe render. It assumes everything can maybe render. So it's going to have to send essentially everything that is related to that. Whereas we're able to work backwards from the functions that we know we're going to execute, if that makes sense. So like we know, like if this button, here's maybe a better example. If this button was receiving some data, like let's imagine it was receiving like a multiplier or something like that as a color. Sure, it's receiving color. I don't know why it's using color. Maybe it's like a color wheel or something like that. Sure. Yeah, this is a decent example. So we've got color. It's coming in. It's going into a style. And then this is a top level component. We know style is never going to update. We don't need to serialize style. We don't need to run any of the apply code related to color, right? Like all of that gets to be tree shaken. And this is across components as well.
So even though we added some code to this component, it's still just these same 3 functions that get serialized to the browser, unless the parent is actually sending in a stateful color, and then the parent would cause that to be pulled in.
Yeah, how does that work? Because this if you go up here, sorry, this apply color, who calls it? Like,
so this is also not exported. We're still this is something that actually does not fully work yet, attributes, which is, kind of a fundamental thing. That's also why a lot of our demos are all in one file right now. But this is a function that can be exported. And so the parent can just pass the color in, just like we're passing in apply count. So if you have a click handler that changes the color that's passed in, you can call this function, and if that's stateful and that click handler is calling it, then that's going to cause this to be included in the bundle and it'll be available. If the parent just passed, just use this like my button color red, that's going to be called that would be called from its apply function, which doesn't get included, and so this apply color wouldn't get included.
Because just so I follow, if they just put that static value in, the parent never needs to import the apply color function, because we know that it would have already been rendered on the server.
It does import it,
okay.
But it would only use it from within its apply function, because this is where all the static stuff goes, right? So it would call apply color from its own.
And if it was not stateful, then its apply function wouldn't have made it to the browser, which would then tree shake out the rest of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, its apply function will never make it to the browser unless it's like actually needing to be rendered from scratch in the browser, right?
Right.
Which
So
is the case if it's like under a stateful control flow. So under a stateful loop or under a stateful if statement, basically, because that's the only
Right.
case where you need to render something from scratch in the browser with an MPA.
Wow.
And this isn't just like static values, to be clear. Like Michael put a string literal red there. It's not because this is a static value. It could be a dynamic value that's calculated based off of, the input, or calculate, like it could be new date or something like that. As long as it's not derived from state, it does not make it to the browser.
Yeah, so we've kind of coined a term for this just to help us talking about it. So we have static values, which, this is obviously a static value. And then we have dynamic values like the count, which actually do change. But then we also have inert values is what we've been calling them. And they are essentially static values, but they're kind of like dynamic static values, if that makes any sense.
Basically, they need to be created.
It's something it is dynamic on the server. Like not every user would necessarily receive the same value. Maybe it's based on the URL, but it's something that will not change once it gets to the browser. And so both values, or reactive applicators that have to do with static and inert values can be eliminated from the bundle.
Yeah. It's probably a little bit like new terminology if people kind of but basically the compiler, using the reactive graph, using the reactive language, knows what is stateful, fine-grained, like right down to the signals, and knows their dependencies. So we can trace that whole graph and go, these are the things that actually can change in the browser and the rest of the stuff can't. And so you can take these components and maybe subtrees of components that look like they're pretty stateful, which would be included, if you're using Astro, would be included as islands, and basically go, no, actually, we don't need half this code. Maybe we don't need 3/4 of this code still within these stateful looking components, simply from the fact that we know what can change.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, this, I don't know if this is coming across. I don't know if anyone wants to throw something in the comments or the chat if this is making sense. It's a little bit technical. We knew we'd get here, and this wanted to focus on the DX part, but essentially the same thing that allows us to have really interesting and powerful development experience actually informs the templating, right? Because there is a clear syntax around these tag variables, around because like they all derive from each other. Like the fact that you can have mylet has a specific syntax, so we know that it could be stateful. And Marko's compiler walks through files into other files, cross modules boundaries, and figure out that.
That's definitely something that's probably the most unique thing about the Marko compiler itself. I'm not aware of another framework compiler that is actually going across templates and like being like, oh, okay, how is my child set up? Okay, if my child is this, then I'm going to merge stuff. And like, we're actually looking across templates to produce more.
Right. TypeScript looks across templates, but it actually doesn't change any of the like compiled code with the knowledge that it gains from that.
Like, just as an example, Marko, so if you're this apply color thing, so we're receiving a color attribute, the parent component needs to know that this thing receives a color attribute and that it's called apply color, right? If this thing didn't receive a color attribute, say it received no attributes, the parent would just not even call that function. It knows that the child component has nothing to do with it. So yeah. The parent needs to also, like, there's also stuff around like scope merging and the data serialization that requires a little bit of analysis across components, but that's getting into the technical, and like ultimately it doesn't really matter. Like for the most part, all we want to do is guarantee that we're only sending code that is necessary for the browser, and we want you to be able to write in this nice language and not really look under the hood, right? Because in Marko 4 and 5 right now, we have a tags API preview that allows you to use like all the same syntax. It doesn't have the same performance characteristics, but you're able to not even think about how it's working under the hood. And that's part of the benefit of it being a language as well, right? Like we get to optimize things for you. So in general, like you probably, like maybe in the future we come up with something that's like 10% smaller and it's like totally different or something like that. This seems like a pretty, like we're getting pretty close to the metal at this point. Like where's the reactive runtime here? There's a queue function that's imported.
Yeah.
So
you guys aren't like, there isn't a reactive. The reactive system is actually compiled away. It's worth pointing out. Even though the language is reactive, when you use the language reactivity, our knowledge of signals and effects and derivations, even though it's there, this like Svelte kind of compiles it away. Not even into primitives, but literally topologically sorted functions that have dirty checking wrappers around it. If you notice in the template, there's some ifs, and that's what's going on when it's like write. It's like if write. It's just saying like did this change, right?
Yeah, I think this is a key differentiator from Svelte. Maybe I missed what you were just saying, but like essentially, Svelte has this function of all your stuff with a whole bunch of dirty checks in it, right? Marko breaks up those functions into as many as are needed to describe the dependency graph with a single dirty check in each one, right?
Yes, it's fine-grained.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you said at one point, what was it? Like Svelte is like if you took a compile time React, and Marko 6 is like if you took a compile time solid, basically, yes. Right?
Yeah.
So, and the bundle size, I mean, we haven't mentioned it on stream. I don't know if we've even shared it publicly, but like right now it's sitting around 5 KB all in. And that's a little large compared to like Preact or something like that. But I mean, that's literally all in with all of the features.
Yeah, because if you use Preact with hooks, it's about 4.3 kilobytes. So not too far off that. Svelte is sitting at 2 kilobytes. So but the thing is, the component scale is a whole other conversation of how big.
Right, and that's honestly like the 5 KB. Marko right now is like 16 KB or something like that. Like that's not really been our focus as far as how can we get this runtime small. It's because we have this giant other problem over here of all of the code that you're bringing into your application in general, right? Like that's where we're going to save hundreds of kilobytes of JavaScript. And this, the scaling and the way you look at the JavaScript bundle size, it's a completely different scenario when you're looking at things from this way.
I think having these two values that intertwine might be helpful to look at as well if we want to do that real quick. So we've got the initial values coming in and apply, but what you'll notice is that apply count and apply multiplier both queue this apply with count and multiplier, and that function is what actually updates this text node. So you can get here from both apply count and apply multiplier. And this is just like what you expect from fine-grained reactivity, right? But like if you change count and you don't change multiplier, then just the count stuff runs, and then it calls this function and updates this, but apply multiplier never has to be called, right? And so this queue function is kind of the, like we said, the only piece of the runtime that ensures, and you see it's actually got a queue priority here. And if we go to apply count, like this also has a queue priority as its second argument. So, this ensures that apply count is going to run before apply with count multiplier in case like both of these were to update. At the same time.
Queuing is still important because it's like any kind of reactive graph. At a certain point, you're going to have these diamond shapes and these like large like chains of derivations, and you want to make sure that everything runs in the right order and runs once.
Right. And we we went through a number of different scenarios where like, can we do this, purely compile time? And it's like, for a lot of scenarios, yes, you can, but there's always cases that exist that like you have to do some kind of runtime sorting. So we do have, that little bit of a priority queue in order to enable like cross value like intersections.
Yeah, we've got a handful, actually a scooping handful of optimizations that we can apply on top of this model that we're going to be tackling, and getting rid of queues in some cases and merging things such that the execution order is defined within the actual compiled functions is one of those. It's just not something we've tackled yet because we're trying to flesh out like the base case unoptimized, which is kind of funny because this whole thing is like already quite optimized.
Do we want to actually share how we've been doing so far in the JS framework benchmark?
Sure, if Michael has the...
Do you have the results?
Let's see, what port is this on? I think it might be running on port 8080 already.
Still running from earlier. Yeah, because I mean, this is as you mentioned, we don't have multiple components. We haven't there's features missing, but we have enough features to make it to do MVC, and we have enough features to make the JS framework benchmark. And there's still room for optimization here. This is just really preliminary. This is
we're not happy about this.
Yeah, we're not happy about select row, but no one's ever happy about select row unless their framework's named solid. So solid uses runtime activity in a way that some people might consider cheating, but it's legit because it's not using the DOM. It is actually using the reactive system. But
right.
Yeah, I want to be clear that there has been basically zero tuning of this as well. It's just like, yeah. So it's something that might go a little bit in either direction because we're not totally done either, like with the feature set. Maybe there's something we find and we need to make performance slower, but we are trying to stick to like within this range. So
yeah.
And if you look at, we have the Marko 4 on here.
You can see one of the benefits of this approach. Yeah. I always tell people that Solid has one weakness. It's that the nodes require memory because of just like the reactive system has a cost. And that's why if you look in the comparison to Flirt, which is the code name for Marko 6, you can see that Solid's clear rows is red compared to it, because that is the one benchmark that I can't bring down. And if you look at this overhead, because it's just vanilla, you've compiled out the reactive system, has basically the same clear rows or memory characteristics very similar to vanilla JS. It's way better than any other framework in terms of clear rows, and even makes Solid look red in comparison. Other than that, it is significantly faster than pretty much most of the other ones here. Right now, it's sitting very similar to Inferno on performance, but we were kind of just grabbing some of the big ones. We actually grabbed this for a presentation the other day internally, and you can see the common players like Lit, Svelte, Vue, Preact, React, and old Marko. This is basically miles ahead. As I said, right now we're sitting around Inferno level performance, and we're going to kind of figure out where we go from here. If you look at it, other than select rows is the only thing killing us here. The rest of the numbers are actually other than select rows, would stick Flirt probably right up in the same range as Solid. Like if you look at the rest of the numbers, they are actually like almost identical, like tiniest bit bigger on create, tiniest bit bigger on partial. Yeah. So my guess is this would go from a 115 down if the partial wasn't part of, or the select row wasn't part of the equation, easily into the sub 10s or whatever, but yeah, we'll have to see what we can do with this approach.
Yeah. But I think the age old, the fastest code is the code that never runs, is the part that obviously we care a little bit more about, and the aggressive tree shaking and all that stuff. We just don't want your JavaScript running in the browser. Like if you have to hydrate 10,000 rows, you lost.
Like this is the client side rendering. This is like in ideal world, Marko isn't even going to be doing most of this work because it's a partially hydrated framework. This is just what happens when it happens to do the stateful stuff. So this is pretty fast.
again, the idea is that we obviously want it to be fast and like within the ballpark of these things, but this is just like kind of a secondary benefit of the the way we're splitting stuff up and trying to make the components themselves small and tree shakeable and all that stuff. It's just obviously we care about the client side rendering performance, and maybe once we have everything else fleshed out, we'll come back here, and I hope someday that we'll be able to knock Solid off the throne, but it isn't really our focus.
Yeah. But
I don't know.
So this is just some client performance. I don't know if we want to demo on this. I want to talk a little bit about resumability. We introduced it at the beginning, but we haven't really impacted and talked about what that effect is on async data or like anything.
Yeah.
I want to talk about resumability and how it actually, because it's not just about hydration. When we know what's on the server and what's on the client, it actually changes, because the one thing that we haven't really highlighted here so much is we saw those lexical scopes arrays, right? When we were looking at it, like all those read 1, read 2, read 3, and Qwik has a very similar mechanism too. That lets us hoist it, get rid of the closures, and break the event handlers apart from the rest of the running code. But it means that we serialize potentially. If we were naive and we thought everything could run in the browser, well, we've actually upped our serialization. We serialize everything aggressively. That actually makes our load larger potentially, and our HTML even bigger. And that's actually really quite bad. Again, I could pull up that Remix example where the data serialization is basically the crippling difference between Remix and Marko. So I'm just kind of knowing what's on the server and what's on the client. How does that change the equation?
Well, I think it's, kind of like I was describing before. In an ideal world, you want to know exactly what's necessary to be serialized for the stuff that is going to run in the browser. Okay, so then you have to walk back from that. What is the stuff that needs to run in the browser? And we've kind of solved that problem to these, hydrate functions, right? And so we're able to look at just those hydrate functions. What are those? What do they use? Let's just serialize that, which means that anything that is used to initially render a template is never serialized. If you don't know that a template could re-render or something like that, if you're not doing this analysis, well, then, okay, maybe it could re-render, so you have to serialize its input, or you have to serialize, all the other things that you would need to serialize. So I think the only way you really get around that is by knowing, okay, this is the code that is going to execute in the browser, and this is, and we have that. So
yeah, I'm trying to think of.
I could go into other benefits to that, but as far as like the raw, what needs to be serialized to continue in the browser, I think it does just come down to figure out what needs to run in the browser. These hydrate things that add event listeners.
It's the things that need to run in effects and the things that need to run in event handlers, right? Basically, you can load, like picture an example where you load a bunch of data on the server in the kind of server land and then you go and render your page with this data. We own that data could be a user with first name, last name, and an address or something, right? Like a bunch of information, and we could display all that information on the page about the user. But we also have this piece of information. We also only have one button on the page that lets you, let's say it's your own profile. Let's pretend you can't edit everything. I don't know why you do this, but pretend you can just only edit the first name in this location. In that scenario, look, actually, no, that's not even a good one. A better example would be a list of users, like a table of users, where you have a for loop and you're basically showing a whole list of users, and pretend all you can do is change the first name of any user in that list. Even though we show all the users' data, because there's only an event or a click handler that interacts with that, person's first name, we can choose to only serialize the first name of every entry rather than serialize the whole list of data. And we know this because of the reactive graph and how and where things are used. I don't know.
And actually, depending on how it's implemented, like if you could read that value from an input itself, right? Like if you had server rendered and the editable input, you don't even need to serialize it in that case.
It's
right.
if you read stuff from scope that
that's
was
kind of
initialized on the
messing up
server.
your
Yeah.
that's kind of messing up your example, but
yeah. But what I'm trying to say is it's not as simple as like all or nothing.
right.
Like it's not like if you load a list of users and you need some data from those users, you're not just like in this like condition where you're like, oh well, now I need these users. It's like literally Marko will automatically figure out which fields within that nested data need to be serialized simply from the usage. They won't send the whole user, will only send the pieces. And you might be like, well, is that unsafe? What if the view changes to depend on that data or whatever? But it's all reactive stateful graphs. And because you know that data is fetched outside, like in the non-state area, like in the server area, you know that nothing on the client could cause it to render again, like to cause it to fetch again. So
and actually, even in the case that you could say that async fetching is something that it's driven by a piece of state, right? Even in that case, we don't need to send it down except for where it's actually needed, because what's presumably going to happen, say this is all from a fetch call, right? You've got this piece of state that's like, maybe it's a call to like a get user API in this instance. So when the state changes, we go make a call to that API and we get a whole new user object, right? And so we didn't need the old user object in the browser. And we would actually, depending on how you're using it, right? Maybe we need parts of the old user object because you can, do certain things with it. Maybe there's an effect that like logs the name. Well,
I think
that
maybe an
causes
example
the
would be
name
like
to be sent down.
if you're doing this like hit on the database and you didn't need to serialize any of the additional data, you're just sending in new data that's from the form. Presumably you still need like the user ID or something like that to actually do the fetch request to that specific user. And so that user ID is probably going to be read in your effect that does the fetch, right? And so that's what Marko is going to serialize, but nothing about the user necessarily. It's just totally what you're using in the effects and event handlers. And so I think along the same vein, I mean, it's interesting that Marko's serializing things, hopefully the minimal amount compared to other frameworks. I think we're definitely approaching that, and it automatically dedupes stuff and whatever. But there is a developer experience side of this as well, like most kind of performance things. But so like, we said at the beginning, sort of Marko's promise in Marko 6 is that we only render your component once, be it on the server or in the browser. And that actually is huge because there's a number of cases where if you have a framework that does this like restart / re-render style hydration, that you don't actually want to redo work. Like sometimes it feels really bad. If you're doing like an async task on the server, like say you're doing that fetch on the server. Okay, well, you probably don't want to redo the fetch when you client-side render, right? So, okay, now you've got to build a cache and you've got to serialize this cache and like all that stuff. But you just don't have to think about that with Marko 6, right? Like you're able to just do the fetch. The server did the work. Okay, we serialize anything that's necessary in these event handlers and effects. If the state changed and caused that fetch to happen again, okay, now we're doing the fetch in the browser. But like for that hydration process, it just doesn't do it again, right?
Right. Because because essentially, if you view that async data as like a async memo or computation or whatever, like if you view it as some kind of derived state, so like you're fetching users by ID, and essentially whenever the ID changes, then you fetch the user.
Right.
If Marko does that work on the server and gets the user and finishes that and renders it in, we know because we don't rerun any derivations on the, like any of these kind of computations on the client, we're safe. We know that we don't, like, it's not going to rerun, right? I'm just reiterating what you're saying again. I just want to use the reactive terms because simply the fact is it looks at where we use it. So grab the couple fields that are used, in the effects, but its default, because it's not in that hydrate function, is not to run it again, which, I'm just
Yeah, like a whole level of things and caching and serialization and like query related stuff becomes so much simpler. And in general, like those kinds of things you want to be doing on the server anyways and not repeating the work. And so you're going to end up serializing it in some way. Yeah, so it ends up just like eliminating a class of problems.
Right, like all the like special kind of query libraries, that have come sprung out on the single page app side, where they're like doing SWR and like doing all these like Apollo and like a lot of those kind of things, where the whole way, the trick they have to do is when you do that initial run, you load all the data from the server into this cache on the client, so that when the client replays it and does it, it goes, oh, I don't have to hit the server again. I've already got it in the cache. And that's the process. And it's actually a pain in the ass for streaming. I mean, this is what I hit when I was working on GraphQL for Marko, because everyone assumed, like, picture it. If you're sending the page in chunks and you're doing the query and queries in chunks on like different queries on your page, and you the first section finishes, like that async fragment or suspense boundary, depending on what your viewpoint is, finishes, and you can send its data, but maybe something else hasn't finished yet. And almost all the existing solutions assume that the server's done, serializes all the data into the page, and that all that data is present before the client can start hydrating. And they build these whole libraries around this. Whereas what's cool about the Marko 6 approach is that part is just abstracted right out. You don't care. You just do the fetch. You don't have to let Urkel or something necessarily like do the serialization, if especially if it's something in the server side where you're not like triggering the cache. But like essentially what ends up happening is it just serializes, Marko automatically serializes only the fields you use and what you actually need. And then it does it piecewise because it's built right into the system. You don't have to worry about these weird cache inconsistencies. It's just how it works.
Right. And that's key. Like if you're doing a request with SWR or anything like that, and it's getting serialized, you have to serialize all of it because you are running all of it again in the browser. We aren't, right? And we're only attaching the stuff that is actually necessary to hydrate the page. And so we serialize what's necessary for those things and nothing more automatically, right? So it ends up serializing less and it's automated. And you don't need these like crazy wrapping libraries that are doing weird things, especially like once React starts and some of these solutions start actually supporting streaming, they're going to hit so many roadblocks and issues. Like it's a different challenge when you're trying to stream stuff out and also create this like buffered cache thing so that we can replay stuff back when it like gets to the browser and this async. Yeah. Anyway, so that's going to be an interesting challenge for the React ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the interesting things here, is because these pieces all start playing nicely together when you start realizing it, because that knowledge for partial hydration and reduces the serialization costs, and this resumability reduces the caching, and suddenly you're just pulling all the stuff out of the browser, which is de facto what you think you need for a single page app. Like when you come in and you're like, I need these libraries, and it's like, no, maybe you don't need these libraries because these just aren't even problems. And there's this sort of kind of simplification here in terms of the model there. But obviously this is something that we enjoy because we're working here on a multi-page app, and we know, I think Ryan threw it up here at one point, MPA limit the lifetime of the components before the server would be involved again. So essentially we just know that this stuff will never be rendered again. So like we can just optimize a way, because we know on the next page load, well, we're starting from scratch again, and just that whole class of libraries, suddenly go away. Like Remix has been enjoying playing this game on a very light level, in that they've been like, oh, look, you move everything to the server, suddenly you remove a whole class of libraries you need to use. But the Remix story isn't the complete story, because it's still assuming that everything renders in the client. So there's still this song and dance. They've solved the fetching problem, like the loading problem, for the most part, other than the serialization and the double data problem, which again is why Marko and those examples look good. But they've got rid of the waterfalls. But they haven't, like for mutations, it's not like that, because like if you mutate and then you redirect to a new location, like you do this kind of, in single page apps, you do this kind of dance where you do the mutation and then you get the result back, and then you migrate to the new place, and then you fetch the data for the new location, and then you get the result. Whereas with an MPA mentality, where you're not playing around with like updating the caches and kind of doing this dance. You just go mutate, server respond with a new location. You've cut out the middleman, and that's really what's kind of powerful in terms of simplifying the model. And I think this kind of ties into other frameworks, like Astro have kind of come in, and Slinkity, and they're kind of enjoying this on the static side, but they're only just getting to the dynamic parts. They haven't got to the point where they're leveraging stuff like streaming, or to kind of leverage these other aspects of things. And I think it's interesting because React is actively looking into this. Like if you've ever seen React server components, hopefully you saw it on my stream maybe, it's very similar to the Marko 4 or Marko 5 mentality of how things work. It's actually a lot like Astro. People think at first that, oh, React server components is about rendering some components on the server. It's not. It's actually a complete architectural change that resembles Islands architecture, except they have a smart-ish way of re-rendering the server portions. But you still route full pages, and then they do like the work on the server and kind of ship it back as if it's an MPA. It's just the client's smart enough not to unload the state and do some smart diffing there. And to be fair, React's looking at ways to make it not full page anyways. So it is definitely one of those things where good work is being done in this space. But it's interesting for me mostly is because Qwik and Marko are kind of like, that's not good enough. Like we want to go beyond Marko 4 or Astro or React server components. And at first this seems like just an optimization, but I hope from the conversation and what we've covered here, you can kind of see that this is actually a DX win, because you're not going like .server or .astro all over the place. And hopefully you can see that's a performance win because of the granularity of the change. And basically, and it saves on data serialization. It literally saves on every single aspect. I wrote an article a while ago about the challenges of hydration, and and it boiling down to like this duplication. Like you're duplicating either view code, or sorry, you're duplicating either data or you're duplicating like the view code essentially, right? Like either you're shipping your components and your HTML, and you're duplicating your data and the data serialized into that HTML. And Marko's approach here is removing that duplication across the board in a way that's performant on the client and the server. So it's very powerful, but we're still an MPA, right? So we're still, some people are like, well, that's, my app is more interactive. I want those client-side transitions. And I think what's interesting about what we're doing here is it's opening up the ability for us to kind of look beyond the MPAs of today. And I think maybe it's time we actually talk a bit about this, because I know we've been talking about Marko 6, and if people have any questions about Marko 6, maybe now's a good time to kind of throw them in the chat, because otherwise I want to move on to talking about some more interesting stuff, because I think Marko 6, even though it's the realization of work that's been going on for a couple of years now, and even longer when I look at some of the articles that where Michael was like hinting at reactivity in like with observables, like back in 2018, like back around the hooks were announced and stuff. Even though this has been like 3-4 years in the making in terms of getting to this point, it's still a bridge to where we're heading. And I think we should talk about that, because I think that vision is really powerful. Because sure, Marko seems really good for its use cases. You build e-commerce. I mean, it's a no-brainer. But can Marko be the framework for the future? And I think the answer for that could definitely be yes. But we should talk about it and kind of share some of our ideas, I think. And also, as I said, anyone got any more questions in the chat, feel free to fire them. But yeah, let's launch into this, because we talked a bit about Remix, and we talked about routing, and we talked about React server components. Should we just dive right in?
So we talked a little bit about how we're serializing the hydration data. Do we want to look at maybe just a simple example, like the counter example that we have in the repo, just to see what that hydration data looks like? Or
if people are interested, I would say yeah. But at the same time, it's like kind of it's a serialization format, and it's based off of these scopes, and
Right.
we're like, so it is kind of an implementation detail. We do think it's a pretty
I think it's
terse, and
helpful. Yeah, well, because the
it
terseness
might
is
be
kind
helpful
of the
to show
key.
the full vision. Yeah, so maybe have it ready to go, but I think we should ease ourselves into this a little bit.
Okay.
So like, to me, looking at Marko, it's always, how can you strike the balance between the MPA performance and the DX of what is now mostly SPA applications. And it's tricky. And with Marko 4, I think it kind of leaned more on the DX of trying to make it so that you could write components that did client-side rendering with partial hydration, but it wasn't necessarily as performant as you could get an MPA, right? And so I think with Marko 6, we've really gotten pretty darn close to, this is nearing peak MPA performance with those interactive updates where you define a let. Like, essentially, where you define your state determines how much code gets sent to the browser, which is pretty great. But I mean, on the DX side, going back to DX, it's like, what are we missing from SPAs? What, like Ryan said, you want to be able to add an animation when you're transitioning pages, or you just want to be able to preserve state when you're transitioning pages. Like, you've got a video player and you want it to continue playing when you go to the next page. Like, things like that are not possible with an MPA. And that's not great. You can build a SPA with Marko, and that's fine. Like, especially with Marko 6, it's going to have good performance characteristics, a good API, and all that stuff. You could build a SPA with it, but you're going to lose all of that resumability from the server and the tree shaking and all that stuff, because you're going to need everything, right? Yeah. And so this is our question: is how do we maintain the performance characteristics that we want, while also giving that last little bit, the SPA-like behavior, and also not making it so that you have to like jump through hoops and feel like you're in a completely different world, and like, this is a frame over here that's HTML and it like kind of doesn't stay in sync, and like all that stuff. We want to have an actual solution. So that's what we've been thinking about really for years. And we think we're with the current implementation of Marko 6, we think we're on a track to get there. So yes, Ryan, what do you think is the first step in describing this future?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the problem, well, I mean, it starts with routing. I think that is the key part there. How that routing works is complicated, and that's why Dylan's asking this question, because there's a lot of elements to it. But we need a new type of router, or a new type of router.
Maybe it's important to think of like why this starts with routing. And it's because the main thing that we're missing right now from Marko with MPA is, how do you persist state across pages, right? And if it's across pages or sections of pages, what is doing that transition, right? It's a router that's in front of that knows that it's changed. So I think one key is that we want to, again, avoid sending everything to the browser. Okay, so we want to have the server involved to some extent. And certainly we probably don't want to send a router to the browser. Like, routers typically end up being quite a bit of code anyways. Like, you've got all your routes and how to load all these things. Like, we don't want that. We don't want to have it like, you start with Marko and it's resumable, and then later we download your SPA. That's not what we want, right? What we want is to have a router that lives on the server that is smart enough to give us an update that can be streamed in and preserves as much state as possible. So I could get into the details of sort of what we're imagining that looks like. Questions are also obviously welcome at any point in time. And I don't know if should I just drive this like from start to finish, or how do you want to do this, Ryan?
It's fine. You can keep on talking. I'm trying to pull some stuff up in the background that'll help you with your explanation. But yeah, just
I think showing what Michael was talking about earlier with what our scopes look like might help. But so essentially, the core idea is this: we've got a page. We've described how you can do the optimal, add the hydration to the page. Okay, so what happens when we go to another page? Well, if it's a brand new page, full with like totally different content and components, it's actually going to be faster to just send the new HTML for the page and stream that in. But the case that you actually care about is when there is stuff that is similar. So imagine that we've got a router that looks kind of similar to what a spa like router has today, a nested router where you've got this top level, page that has some content that's persisted across different views. Like, it's got this side nav, and this is the example Ryan's showing is from Remix, which illustrates, nested routing quite well. But I think looking at this from a nested router makes a lot of sense. So let's just imagine, okay, we've got this top level page that has a router inside of it, and it's got, in the outer shell of the router, it's got this nav, and then there's an inner shell one level deep that has a different nav in this case, and then there's another shell inside there. Okay, so now let's take this as the starting point. Okay, so what happens if we navigate to, from sales to expenses in this case? What do we want to persist on the page? We want that left side nav to persist, but we're going to an entirely different component when we go to the expenses page. So what we actually want is the server to stream us the new HTML for the expenses page. Okay.
And
so
just pause.
Yeah.
The reason we want that, just to be absolutely clear, and this is something that Mishko was in complete agreement with, even if you can progressively load, is that we don't want to suddenly have to load all the JavaScript to render said page. When you're in a single page app and you go to there, you need to load the whole thing. Like, it's just necessary. Whereas we want to keep our partial hydration. We want to only load, we want the HTML obviously for the whole section, but then we only want to load the JavaScript that you can interact with. Maybe there's only like a couple things on this page you can actually do. Like, this page looks like it has almost no interactivity that I'm looking at here on the sales page. Like, what can you do here? Like, you don't want to send all the JavaScript to render this, where any client-side single-page app, that would be exactly what you're doing. Okay, sorry.
Great. Yeah, so I mean, continuing, essentially, if you're navigating to what is entirely new components, it is going to be more efficient to leave as much on the server as possible and just get the new HTML for those sections. And in a lot of ways, it's like, oh, are we talking about like iframes and nested iframes? But no, there's the other piece of this, and this is the piece that's actually challenging, because you could do what I just described, like swapping out the HTML for these nested sections using something like turbolinks or whatever, where it's just, there's a server and you get some HTML and you put it there, but like nothing's actually in sync and there's a weird DX and like all that stuff. But what about the part that actually persists? That's the interesting part. How can we know, in this case, in the top level, I'm assuming when you navigate from sales to expenses, it's going to change what's actually selected there, right? Maybe that's rendered on the server. And we're saying when we hit this page, what we actually want is if it's a new nested route, we're going to get the HTML for that. If it's an existing route higher up in the tree, what we actually want is the server to give us essentially just the values of everything that's in the scope that should update, which is where going into Michael's thing might make more sense. But in essence, what you actually want is there's going to be like a class on sales and on these LIs, and that class is going to be tied to something that the server is aware of. Like, the server is going to know that this is a server only component, and I can render this class using like the apply like mechanism. And essentially what we want is when we ask the server for the new page, okay, we knew we were on this page already. Ideally, just tell me that class changed. And so that's kind of what we're going through. Do you want to take it over, Michael?
I sent it to Ryan, so he's got it pulled up there.
Okay.
Yeah, talk about this. This is the scope.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, this data format probably doesn't make tons of sense. But like, there's a scope. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's unnecessary in the scope. That's why we have a sparse array here. So the Marko compiler figures out what's necessary to go into these scopes. But the key is that if you opt into this router, it's going to mark things that are what Michael called inert. So dynamic on the server, but stateless. it's going to mark those with something that says, okay, you can update this at a specific scope. If you give me a scope in the runtime, we can go and just update that property directly. So in
You're
this
using
case,
the reactive graph again, essentially.
yes. So essentially on the server, we know the reactive graph of all of the things that couldn't change in the client, but can change on the server. And so what we are going to do is send back a response format for subsequent requests that essentially is, okay, what are the reactive graph pinpoint updates for the stuff that was persisted across the pages, and stream me the HTML for any new nested routers that were swapped out. And in general, we believe that's going to be like the best of both worlds kind of thing. Because, you know, if you want to have an experience where you've got something like this video player, just move it up higher in the route hierarchy like you would do in a SPA. The authoring experience is going to be very, very close, if not identical to a SPA. But now you don't need to ship the router to the browser. You don't need to ship any of these nested routes to the browser to render like holistically. Each of these nested routes actually becomes their own little hydration bubble where we can do this partial hydration stuff, right? Like we tree shake the top thing. We tree shake the sales section. We tree shake this invoices section. So like all across the board, we're essentially saying, let's do as much work on the server as possible when we navigate. But if there's something that was already in the browser, we'll just update it for you.
Yeah, so just so to visualize it, because this issue, sort of this example from Remix is really awkward because they show you how they dynamically import the JS and fetch the data at the exact same time. This is not what we were talking about here. What would happen in these sort of navigations, and I guess I should go back to this one, is like the same response, you know, in a streamed format, maybe, you know, where there's a bunch of keys and values, would be able to pass in data and pass in HTML as needed. And essentially, because we know our location and we know where we're going to, and we have some data that we can send on the initial request, we can, you know, send maybe a bit of extra data on our request to the server, and it can basically do the diff for us on the server and then return the chunks of data that need to be updated. And it's just like, okay, slot that into the reactive graph and do all the fine grained updates, essentially, is the gist of it. So this isn't 0 kilobyte components necessarily. Like, it's not like, because now suddenly, because this sales highlight can change in the browser, this is no longer a 0 kilobyte component, but it needs literally just the code to update the one field. So while this is technically heavier perhaps than a pure MPA in the slightest sense on the component scale side, what you're actually talking about here is most of the savings still completely persisting, and most of the work being done on the server, even the diff. So you don't need the full React runtime or the extra. Like, I think we were playing with the React server components demo, and we saw that it was React plus an extra 10K. This probably requires like I don't know how big, but my guess is like a 2 kilobyte, maybe like little bit of extra code on top of what maybe Marko's 4 kilobyte, depending what features you use, like runtime. Like, we're talking sub 10 kilobytes, and then the components are still going to only be shipped mostly like based on interactivity. Like, it's not in components anymore, it's sub-grain. So we're talking about the smallest amount of cost in the browser while being able to keep this single page like persistence and navigation and transitions.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it's probably clear from what you're saying here, but like, if for like updating this sales to expenses or something, like what we're going to send is like that final class value that needs to be updated there. Like, maybe for some reason you decided to use like Lodash to figure out like which classes need to apply. Like, none of that. It's just those final like end values that need to be reflected in the DOM that are going to actually be serialized across the wire for these.
Right. Because there's two types of updates that you can get from a server on a section that is persisted across navigations. One is stuff that was actually rendered on the server. And for those, we would send updates that's just like, okay, walk to where the sales is basically and update its class to this, right? Like the upgrade or the update from the server would say that. Then the other piece is when you've got this like mix of client-side rendered stuff and basically some scope information that was only on the server. And so in that case, it would actually serialize and say, oh, we have an update to this scope that was sent to the browser. Like maybe you have an effect that is, what's a good example? Like an effect that relies on some input that's only available from the server, like maybe, from the URL state or something like that. When you navigate, you actually want to have that effect re-execute, right? And so what would happen in that case is the server would be like, okay, I know that, this section here depends on this scope index, and I serialize this value to this scope index, so I'll send this scope to the browser, and then when we receive that, we'll be like, oh, that scope changed. Okay, fire the reactive graph to execute that effect ultimately again. And so, yeah, it's in a lot of ways like fine-grained updates over the wire with the assumption that if you're just building stuff from scratch, receive the raw HTML stream from the server. So.
Yeah, and I mean, we have on the screen here this like import and fetch, right? Like you said, that's not what we're doing, but like there's a fetch call that needs to be happening here regardless, right? Because we're getting data from an API. What we're talking about is instead of sending that data back in the format that like the API chose to use and then having some JavaScript client side to like get that into the UI that we actually want, just ask the server for the UI that we want, right?
Right.
And so the server takes on the brunt of that work. If you could cache that JSON data, you should be able to cache that HTML response as well, right? So
yeah, I mean, to be clear, we're asking the server for two things. We're saying, give me new UI as HTML, give me updates to old UI as this like scope object that knows how to propagate through the reactive system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we show this for a moment? This is really cool. Someone in our this is actually built on top of Solid Start as a quick demo, but Ryan's probably maybe still in the stream. He just told us to give us your secrets, but he's already aware of some of these secrets, and we haven't done the JSON part or the hydration part, but we were playing around with this idea of how to do nested routing on the server. As I said, this piece is fairly framework agnostic in understanding. I think it's easiest to see it here, but you could picture that there's this home component, and when we go to posts, you can see that it's just doing nested routing like you'd expect. And if we go to post number 1, we're still nesting more stuff in here. And if I go post 1 comments, it's just changing the little bits that we need. This isn't the JSON changing. If we go to post 2, then more like a bigger chunk of it changed. But this is just doing a really simple format. Let's see if I can't prettier this one. But essentially, you're just seeing the HTML being sent in kind of like a serialized format. So the server is actually rendering these portions of the page in a nested way. And then essentially, as we're navigating around here, it's actually the server that's rendering these. And if you want proof of this, and I was talking about size, like let's just look at this quickly hobbled together example in terms of like JavaScript. Let's reload this page. See, I mean, this isn't hydrating. So if there's hydration code, you'd be in the code. This is 1.3 kilobytes. And as I'm moving around and stuff's updating, there's no more JavaScript being loaded here. Obviously, if we were partially hydrating, we would have to load a bit of JavaScript, but this is just showing that the actual routing mechanism and the rendering is just happening on the server. And this is like client routing. Like we could do transitions and stuff like this. We're not redrawing the outer portions of the page. This root element here never gets redrawn, even as we are going through here. And that's kind of really powerful example in terms of understanding how you basically, all you have to do is this is the easy part of the equation, right? The more challenging part is updating the stuff outside of here. But you can kind of see that you've stopped it at zero. Like this is all the JavaScript. Sorry, this is just the JavaScript that we have initially loaded here. Sorry, it's this one here. This is all the JavaScript that we needed to pull off this. We just need a little bit more JavaScript, obviously, like the runtime to actually do the fine-grained updates. But you can see that you're not taking that cost 100% for sure. Like if you didn't go to a page, nothing interactive on it, and you didn't need to do partial hydration, well, you wouldn't load any more JavaScript there, but you would still seamlessly come in and out of that experience. And that's a huge difference from how like static routes work today in Svelte or Remix, because they're like, oh yeah, or Next, they're like, okay, sure, you could make this page static, but then you're like basically opting into doing the full page reload to get into it and to do the full page reload to get out of it. Like it's not, you're suddenly in like temporary MPA mode. It's not this transition, it's binary. It's like no code, it's like no JS, it's moving the script tag or adding the script tag. And this is doing it, incrementally as you need it. And this, as I said, this nesting is part of the key here of not needing to, like, it lets you reset where you're thinking. You're like, oh, we know everything below this part is rendered on the server. Generally, having control flow, like switching sections of page, means that's stateful. And by using nested routing, we're kind of opting back into like, no, this is on the server, and we get to kind of reset our islands. We get to start that again inside of another island, perhaps. So.
Yeah, and I think the implications of it are actually pretty crazy. Like essentially, with what we're planning, if you want to have something be client rendered, you just use the let tag, right? Like that's going to be a state that's going to bring in the hydration code that's going to do a client side render. If you want something to render on the server, just don't use the let tag, drive it through input, drive it through the URL that you're going to get information about from the router, right? But you're not really going to be able to tell from the user's perspective what's rendering on the server, what's rendering in the browser. It's just up to you and how you want the code to execute.
Yeah, it's really cool how automatic this is, right? Because one of the things that we've been noticing, and I mean it's more obvious when we were talking about Marko earlier and talking about Marko 6 API, was that like essentially like there isn't like, oh no, you can't do render props, or oh no, you need to mark this special thing. It's literally you just write the code the way there is nothing in any of the examples that we were doing on the user part where you're writing the code where you were worrying about the server client thing. And sometimes today, Marko 4 or 5, we admit that's a trap, because if you don't project data in the right way, you might be including too much on the browser and stuff. But with the smarts of Marko's 6's compiler and fine granularity, you can basically start your top level page and like you can't do this today in Marko. Today, if you put a class on the top level page, it's like, well, that page must be rendered in the browser, and bad things happen because Marko assumes that the root is server component. But if with Marko 6, like essentially suddenly you just start adding state because you want to or need to, and everything will just derive from there. I mean, to be fair, with this routing paradigm, you probably have to be like a little bit wise. Like you might have to be like, oh, okay, well, we're not going to introduce state here if we don't need it. We're just going to derive stuff off the URL or whatnot. But it is really cool that there isn't no need for like these special kind of distinctions.
Yeah, it's like derive it from the URL, you're rendering on the server. Derive it from state, you're doing a client side render. It's like that simple, right?
Yeah. So to Ryan's point here, let's talk about the challenges with this approach, because there's definitely some things that we need to figure out. I think there's two big challenges. Like the route outlets and just sending the HTML and the hydration data for those pieces is like, yeah, fairly straightforward. So there's the first piece that I think is kind of interesting is what Ryan's mentioning here about how do you update content that's already there. And we can come back to that in a second. And then the second piece that I think is also interesting and challenging is how do we say you have some component on the outside. So because routes are essentially an if statement, right?
Or switch.
Or switch, yeah. And so if you you can write the API in such a way that you can limit this, and actually React Server Components is creating their API in such a way that this isn't something that you can do. But you may want to have a component or context, right, or something like that, where you have some client-side state higher in the tree that then provides that data to something lower in the tree. So I guess React does actually have that with context. But so you need to wire that up such that components that already existed on the client can cause components that just recently hydrated from the server to update, right? So you've got that, and then also how do you update these existing things that are already on the client. And we have some ideas, but I don't.
Yeah, I mean, in general, we don't have any code written for this right now. But it's just, since the compiler does know this is a thing that is possible to change. Like, in the template that was compiled, we know what's static, right? It gets hoisted out into that string. Beyond that, we know that things are dynamic, and they're either like dynamic in that they're derived from state, or there's something that could be rendered on the server, and we know where they slot in as well. And so at the very least, we already know when we re-render on the server a page or a section of the page that was there before, that we don't need all that static HTML again, right? Like, we can at the very least just send, this was the class that was dynamic for this node at index, whatever it was. So, I mean, that's one piece. And then the other piece, like I was saying before, is how do you get scope information into the JavaScript? And we've kind of already solved that too, in that we have the scopes already outside of all of your code, and we can mutate them as we see fit and trigger things. So that piece has a vague solve as well. And then obviously there's like the whole new page thing, which is the simple one, as you say. So in a sense, it all comes back to, we've broken everything up such that we know that it's fine grained, and how we've already labeled all of these things, and we can have markers on these things, and these markers can be rendered only on the server so that we can walk to them without sending the walks array. And there's all these technical details of it and all that stuff that just seems to be lining up in such a way that it looks like we're going to be able to approach the server just sending you the updates to the dynamic stuff that it rendered, and also any scope information for things that are going to be re-renderable in the browser that was calculated on the server.
I think lists are particularly interesting, which is probably the thing, because I think conditionals and stuff are actually fairly straightforward, and people can picture that, and routing falls into that category, because you're kind of like, oh, okay, well, it's this branch or this branch, and you can kind of make that call. Lists are interesting, but I guess Marko for components do have the key by index or key by key, right? So technically, if we sent the key information along with the request to the server, then we could diff the keys on the server and know what new sections need to. And I
Right.
think, I mean, pagination isn't bad because it's kind of obvious, because it's like you're going to new sections, generally you're not reusing it, but it might be an interesting case where you're actually like reloading data that may or may not be the same entries and stuff. So I do think there's some interesting ability to do that. I think lists are probably actually one of the tricky ones. Most of the things I don't think you actually, as long as you have basically the scopes and you have their locations in most cases, that's sufficient to know like, oh, something changed here. And to be clear, it's not just, even though we use a nested router, which is very obvious in terms of like, here's the new section HTML, it might be partials in a sense where like, if let's pretend you're on a page and you have a list of users and then you add a new user, you know, we might be like, okay, well, here's the users that we're currently showing the list. Here's their IDs. Like, here's the key. And then we go, oh, we only needed to add this one user to the end of the list. So that one actually gets the new HTML. Like the HTML partials aren't limited to the router level. They're actually
Right.
can be done at any conditional branch, which now was rendered on the server for the first time.
Yeah, the big thing that the nested router gives us is a simple location to do code splitting for the different sections.
Right.
Like
reset the partial hydration.
Yeah, we've reset the partial hydration there. But as far as like asking the server for new data, conceptually, whenever there is something that would go through the apply stage again, that's when we want the server to send HTML. And that can be, an if statement got toggled, or that can be an for loop iteration changed in some way.
Right.
I mean, ideally with the for loop, we would actually even be able to do, like Ryan said, a diff on the server to know, okay, we can just do that reconciling hard work for you on the server and send you back the reconcile if you move an item in the list and stuff like that, right?
Yeah. And actually, this ties a bit into the conversation I was having with Ryan Florence earlier. I didn't dig into it because, it kind of went on a thing about whether Remix did this or not or whatever. And I don't want to get into that. But essentially, the whole thing about when to fetch, like the key truth here is the router is what's driving it. Like, regardless of whatever async data or whatever other pieces come into us deciding that initial state, the route is the piece of information that gets serialized. It's the date or the request. It's maybe not just the request. The stuff that's sent on the request is the piece that is that source of truth. And that's how we can get away with not using a bunch of lets, because we know that stuff coming from the request isn't stateful, but it's the only place where that data can come from. There's no other source. Like if you have a stateless backend, it's the request where all the data actually comes from. And that's where the route is the logical place, because without it being reflected in the URL, there's no change. Like essentially all change in the website from a server client thing has to be derived from that request. So the route is just the logical place, and making it the URL, using it to nest and subdivide the page is just a really powerful way that we've enjoyed for years on the client side. So why not bring it onto the server side, right? So like it's just kind of it makes a lot of sense, because it's like the router is the backbone of your application. It is what defines the paradigm, right? When we went from server to single page app, it was the routing that led the way. And to whatever we're heading now into this new hybrid place, I think it's an interesting place, because I'm not sure the old school MPA people or the new, single page people, I don't know we'll take them all with us, even though we're trying to merge the things. I don't know if they all come with us, but the key is routing again is going to be the backbone of these mechanisms. It is what defines the web.
Yeah, I mean, we want a spa-like routing experience with as much code running on the server as possible, essentially, or at least like as makes sense in terms of the way you opted into using state in your application.
Yeah, I'm just reading some comments here. Maybe filtering a table would be interesting. Having scopes hoisted is super convenient. Definitely seems like it's solvable, which is exciting. Yeah, there's details here to work through, and they're on the end of a list that we've been kind of working through. But it does seem like the pieces are here. I think that's really take away from this. You've already seen it when looking at Marko 6 that like we either have the pieces or they're kind of a logical extension of what we've been doing. So like this is just very congruent with all the pieces, the serializing scopes, with the fine grain informing how updates happen. It's all really an extension of the same stuff. Yeah, so yeah, it's pretty interesting. Oh, hey Pierre, how's it going? So yeah,
I will say that like it's pretty cool to me that like you navigate when you're doing a navigation in most applications, like in a lot of scenarios, if you're doing a navigation, you're probably fetching some data and all that stuff, right? But like there's the whole waterfall problem. Like you don't want to like if you're doing there's several things, but one issue is, if you're doing all these requests from the browser, well, now the browser is having to, first of all, get like all the unfiltered data in some cases, depending on how you've optimized your APIs using GraphQL and like all that stuff. But it's also doing potentially multiple concurrent requests and all that stuff. Doing it from the server and having the server send you essentially the finalized little chunk of HTML that you actually need is typically going to be like, less bandwidth used by the user. And then your servers typically, like if you're communicating within the same data center, have like faster access to whatever your underlying data stores are and stuff like that. So like in general, it seems like a big win. Like I imagine scenarios that like if you use Marko 6 with this special router and you're rendering like a list of users or something like that, and it's sortable, right? You could implement it such that the sorting happens in the server or the sorting happens in the browser. And if it's a million users, maybe you want to have this sorting happen in the server, right? So anyways, I just think it's going to be crazy to think about that you'll have the flexibility to be like, yeah, this is server rendered and that's where it makes sense, or I can client render the section because it's fine to send this little bit of JavaScript and so on. So yeah.
Brian's asking all the fun questions. Yeah, I mean, it does naturally go here. This is my conversation with Dan Abramoff. This is where the React guys' heads are at right now. They've been trying to figure out how to resimulate the cache behavior. That's why they're looking into caches. It's not because they're trying to make React query. It's because they're trying to get this back. Which is interesting because this is one of those trade-offs that comes with this approach, and this is one of the challenge. And it's not this approach. This is single page app approach. This is what you gave in order to get those smooth transitions.
Right. Yeah, and it'll be an opt-in thing. Like there is going to be some overhead, like Ryan said. We're going to have to serialize additional markers in the output HTML to know this is a thing that can update in the browser, whereas before it could not have. So there will be like a little bit of overhead, but the thing is, it's not going to be much, and kind of it'll be up to you to decide the trade-offs, whether or not you want to build an MPA, which is a little bit more optimized. Maybe you don't care about those transitions or persisting state across pages. Maybe that doesn't make sense for your application, and then so MPAs is going to be the right choice. But we really want to have a solution for people who do have a SPA use case. And I think this solution has very limited compromise compared to our MPA setup.
Yeah, this is an interesting one for me, honestly, because if you think about it for a minute, we're talking single page app benefits, but the mindset.
Oh, did we lose Ryan? You can hear me, Michael?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay.
I think we may have lost Ryan.
I lost it for a second. Sorry. I was going to say
the mindset.
I say that the mindset is closer to that of an MPA, because maybe like the architecture now becomes more shared root because of the nested router. You actually author the structure of your app a bit more like a single page app, but we're not like the client caches and all the like this cache we're talking about here for the back forward routing is a different type of cache. Like that is all the type of the ecosystem libraries like that you need for this stuff are closer to the MPAs. They're not the client side libraries. You know what I mean? Like it's not like I mean, routing is the obvious one for the single page apps, but just even like you're probably like you could use Apollo, but you might just not use Apollo, you know, because you don't need a heavy caching query client for what you're doing. It changes things dramatically, and it's interesting because, as you mentioned, it's like MPA plus, like it's just additive on top of the kind of MPA thing, and it makes sense whenever you're faced with a situation where you kind of have to reset your baseline. You tend to, what you do is you go back to the beginning and the basics and build up from that foundation. It's very difficult to start from the having gone far down a road and then kind of backpedal a bit to kind of reposition it. And I think this does make for frameworks that are coming out right now with this in mind, like Qwik and Marko, in a very unique place. And it's funny because in some ways, even if Marko hasn't really realized, no one's realized this, Marko's been sitting in this zone a little bit for ages, just purely from the aspect of being a JavaScript framework that does MPAs. Like it's almost unheard of. And I think it's kind of interesting. I'm hoping that as people try this stuff, you know, we can learn and we can find what people like here. It's just this is very powerful because what we're saying essentially is that you can build a website like it's static HTML because Marko is just HTML. Then you can add something stateful on top of it, like some interactive form, or I mean, form is a terrible example because you could have just left that form as being, you know, server. But you know, I made a demo the other day where I used a form for the server for like a blog site where, you know, I just posted it and then redirected back to the listing. But when I was on the page, I was like, okay, I've got comments here. I don't want to reload the page every time I add a comment. So let's just, you know, add that nice little bit of, you know, functionality. You know,
but
so
now you'll still get to choose to be able to have that little, you know, the comments persist.
In our ideal world, this is all progressively enhanced or whatever. So then you just add that little bit and you're like, okay, I'm doing that. And then at a certain point, you're like, well, now I actually want to route on the client. And then you just add that little bit again. It keeps an extension of this, and it's built on the same foundation. And from that point of view, like what Marko's doing here makes a ton of sense because it's just this incremental step up to it. I mean, people have been talking about transitional apps and transitioning and stuff, but like, as I said, it's much easier to tell a story where you're coming up from the base. I mean, if you think about it, like React server components, like they've kind of built a whole new framework around React, right? I mean, this might not be obvious to everyone in the ecosystem yet, but like the server components aren't the React components we know today, right? They have a bunch of rules, like they can't have state, like essentially the what I call the Marko rules, you know, like essentially the partial hydration rules. And once you start falling through that dilemma, well, they're like, okay, well, we have React fetch DB, and like if you watch the video, you'll see that they introduced a bunch of libraries for data fetching that are React server component specific. Like, and if you start like kind of connecting the dots, you realize that in server component land, the React's current ecosystem doesn't live. It doesn't exist. It exists only in the client components. It exists only in like classic React now just lives in the islands in this thing. And maybe not everyone's going to adopt this mentality, but like it seems like it takes a fairly extreme shift to actually reset the expectations and build up from again. So I think this is going to be interesting because I think React server components, for example, are a legitimate competitor or like different approach to this problem that's legit. I think Qwik is going to come up with something in the next year or so when they kind of get here too. That's going to be legit and going to be a real, you know, kind of consideration in this sort of zone. But what's interesting for me, especially on the React side, is I think we're talking about like a whole different ecosystem. Like, sure, the existing React ecosystem will exist for those stateful components, But if they only make up 20% of your page, maybe even less, you're not going to pull in Redux, or we already know what Dan Abramoff thinks of Redux. No, but like you're not gonna pull in some of these other libraries that you're kind of accustomed to. Like it's actually really interesting to think of what the implications are. And yeah, I mean, I don't know where this goes completely, but like it's not too far to kind of see that if this is a new paradigm, based around this new routing kind of consideration, like that we are in for something very different than just, it's not single page app plus, you know what I mean? It's something else. And I mean, yeah, I can't wait to see what that looks like, obviously, for me personally, but I just wanted to kind of establish here, like you can already see that what we're talking about is going to be quite different. And I think it's really interesting, as I said, and why I wanted to get my coworkers here and Marko to kind of talk about this, is because they've worked in this MPA zone in JavaScript for ages, longer than most others. And that's actually probably closer in mentality to what this looks like than basically anything that, at least on the JavaScript side, we've seen in a while. I think if we go back and we look at some of the techniques and stuff that they're doing on, the Rails or like the PHP side of things, we might also learn, there might be some secrets still from the past that can come back. But for the most part, this is relatively new ground. And I do want to separate us from some of those other technologies here, because we're not talking about rendering everything on the server all the time necessarily. This isn't HTMX. This isn't like that situation where you're like, oh, I go back to the update panels of the 90s or not 90s, sorry, the mid 2000s, where like you have 3 cascading drop downs in a row and you switch the first one and then they go to the server and they load it in, and then you switch the next one and they go to the server and load it in. I'm not talking about full page refreshes. During this like mid.NET period, we got the ability to swap out just that one section of the page. There are similarities to this, but with a JavaScript first thing, you could do that. You could definitely write your app that way, but you just might not. And because right. You're already in JavaScript, you just have the tool. You're just like, oh, well, screw this. I'm just going to go, when I load this data, I'm just going to let right there. Like,
yeah, I think it's super interesting that, there's 2 sides of it. Yeah, you could write a let. Now it's doing client side. Cool. You decided that makes sense for your experience. But even in the case where you didn't use a let, it's still way more efficient than, doing the whole page request again and like getting the HTML that you didn't necessarily need because it's already there. Instead, you're hopefully going to get, in that case, just a JSON format that has just the new data that came in. So in theory, even that should be more efficient. But it's up to you, where the processing happens. Is it on the server that this makes sense? And in my mind, it's like, are you doing some service call or a fetch or like data loading kind of things? Like if you're doing that kind of stuff, probably it should live on the server because it's going to be async anyways, right? The user is going to have to see some loading indicator. The loading indicator can be client-side render. You could show that right away, right? But then it could do essentially a server-side render to get the update for stuff that was going to be async anyways, right? Which I think is pretty cool, actually.
How does streaming play into this? Because it's a fair question. We haven't, and you've done some stuff with Microframe, eBay's kind of like now micro front end solution, which streams these panels in, but which has similarities. But like how does streaming play into this? Is it important or?
I think it is still important. So obviously for the sections where it is just like an HTML swap, I think streaming is going to be pretty similar to the way that it works now for those sections.
Right. So non-blocking, like we can have async sections inside those sections. Yeah. You can essentially have that whole suspense-like experience where you're like, okay, I navigated to a new page. I showed the main content as soon as I could, but I'm actually still fetching and sliding in placeholders. You can still do it.
Yeah. So I imagine when you navigate to a new page that it would have, basically invalidate the Marko equivalent of those suspense boundaries so that you could know like, oh, this part of the page is actually stale. It's waiting for stuff from the server. So you could still have like immediate responses to say like, oh yeah, this is loading. Like I click delete user. Maybe it doesn't delete right away. Maybe you do an optimistic update where it does delete right away. But you could show like it grayed out for a little bit until it goes away or something, like once the server comes back. You have that kind of ability as well. I mean, you could do all the stuff that you could do with the SPA. It's just, is the update happening from the server in a fine-grained way, or did you control it via a let and effects and like client-side logic? And you get to choose that, which I think is super, super powerful.
Yeah. And actually, now that I think about it more, like one of the reasons that we like, it's funny. I've been using streaming recently in single page apps, obviously. Other than React, Solid's I think the only one that does it on the single page app side. And it's great because you get that initial loading thing. And if it's a fast network, you're like, this feels like Jamstack. Like it feels like the page was statically, you loaded them initially, and then the data was fetched in the client, except the data was fetched sooner. So the experience is just even smoother. It's so much better than blocking in that state. But if the network's slow or you have stuff, and it just comes in when it comes in, and it's no worse than doing like a block render, like a Next or a Remix. But what's interesting is with Marko, this is really felt, because like when I switch to the next page in Hacker News, I don't notice it because I just do a transition. It's stale in my single page app, and then it goes across. But when I do this in Marko and I go to the next page, and it loads the header so fast, I don't even notice that there is a navigation, like a full page unload, and then I see that loading state. So even though I'm clicking around in this MPA, I feel like I'm in a single page app because of how the fragments and the lazy loading and the placeholders all works, or not lazy loading, the placeholders and the fragments and the async.
And one of the things that's going to be different.
What I'm getting at is now with the client side routing, you'll get the ability to hold the transitions the same way the single page apps are doing. But then if you do opt into the nested suspense boundaries with the fallbacks, like I said suspense again, but whatever the Marko equivalent is, it's going to feel very similar to that client render at the nested level, because you're like, oh, there's the immediate response and here's the placeholder again. Like it's actually it's the same thing again, except it's like nested. So which makes it even more like, I think it will be very difficult with well architected apps with this.
Oh, lost him again.
My internet is dying. I'm sorry.
It's okay. With well architected apps, are you still there?
I hear his fan.
Yeah. Maybe his fan's competing for bandwidth or something. Smart fan.
Yeah. I am sorry about that. Yeah, sorry. You lost me again. It seems like when my fan kicks in and the heater, it just like kills the internet somewhat. That's unfortunate. We'll have to get till the end. But what I was saying is, obviously I lost my train of thought because I was just ranting on in this tirade. But essentially, honestly, this is the worst when you go all in and then it disappears. Yeah, I've lost it. I'm sorry.
It's fine. To me, it's when I think of transitional apps, right? And this is maybe not the right way to put it, and I really want a different word for this kind of thing, but I see how do we send as little initial JavaScript to the browser, like MPA benefits? How do we make it so that we're not redoing any of the work? Like those are things that I kind of want to take for granted. And then, okay, so we've done all that. How do we receive the fine-grained updates for stuff that, the server can render? And I think this is approximating that. And that's why I see it as transitional, because you're actually like transitioning from the server rendered HTML, hydrating it to a tiny little router that can receive additional updates and fine-grained update, or you have your manual little states that can do pure client-side rendering as well. And like from your code perspective, like transitioning from client-side rendered to a server-side rendered thing is as simple as like, I'm going to use the URL state or I'm going to use let, right? And there'll probably be, a tag variable that's exposed that gives you the URL state in a way that you can tweak, or you could use forms and like all that kind of stuff. So
yeah, I mean, it is really incredible when you think about it, that both on the authoring side and the experience side, you'd have a hard time telling the difference. That's what I was going to say when I was in that long tirade, that I was basically that I think it'd be very hard to tell the difference between like our single page apps today experience and this, even though it's authored and mechanically in a completely different way. And we're actually saying that the authoring will also be as transitional. So yeah, this is really quite exciting stuff. And I'm interested to see, like, obviously Marko has optimized things to the like nth degree here and kind of showed how this stuff is possible. I just want to see more of this. I'm getting so excited by this potential, because the more I hear about it and think about it, like, it does seem like if it's solvable, that we're that much closer to that whole concept of like the universal app, like screw transitional, let's call it the universal app.
Yeah, something
like that was talked about ages ago when they didn't want to use isomorphic, they started using universal. I mean the actual universal app, because we've had to make sacrifices or trade-offs along the way, and it seems like this is an avenue where most of those trade-offs can go away. To be fair, there are a few. I think the key ones that we have to consider is we are basically hijacking the browser still in the way that single page apps hijack the browser. It's just so much more blatant in this sense, because you are using the server, that it feels like you've just reinvented a VM inside the browser. I accuse React of it. Even our version here, which is much more lighter and fine-grained, like, we are definitely in this model kind of going like, browser, we're not trusting you completely to handle navigation. We're going to handle navigation. We'll use all your protocols, but we're going to handle it. So I think that's going to be the thing here. But I mean, we're used to that. It's been,
I think in general, like a remix style approach where you're using web APIs that could work with or without JavaScript, and the progressive enhancement, all that stuff is a key piece of this also, in terms of like making it easy to progressively enhance those experiences so that you don't feel like you're stepping into a totally different world when you bring in a let or something. You know what I mean? Because in general, for a lot of experiences, keeping as much as possible on the server makes a lot of sense. And I think it's really one of the key strengths of the web in general, right? That you have an experience that can be delivered kind of on the fly. At like, basically, the browser is just receiving raw like display information kind of in like some scripts and all that stuff. And there's always going to be the balance of trying to figure out like, should I be sending new view information, or should I be sending the code to render that new view information? And I feel like Marko 6 and this router is giving you the ability to make those decisions like throughout your app. So anyways.
Yeah. I mean, on that note, I think we're getting close to the end here. We did go longer than I wanted to initially, but I mean, this has been a great conversation. I think I hinted at this a little bit in some articles and some previous streams, but we haven't dug in as far as we have tonight. And honestly, this is still an area where we're working through ideas. We're getting a better understanding. But I mean, right now is your chance. You've got Michael and Dylan here. I've said this a few times. If there's any more questions, definitely shoot it our way here. You have opportunity to kind of look and stuff. I realize we've talked about a lot of stuff today that's kind of out there, and some of you probably will like rewatch parts of the video and try and figure out what was like re-dissect what was said, because admittedly there's a lot of content and it's pretty thick. But if there's any questions or anything, now is your chance, so to speak. But yeah, no, this has been great. I'm so stoked that you guys joined me so we could talk about this stuff, because I've been, as I said, I've been hinting at this on articles for a while now and on some other streams, and it's really awesome to see Marko 6 starting to come together. As there's still work to be obviously done in the compiler and whatnot, but we're actually seeing, you know, that output work. We're seeing the optimizations, you know, happen.
Yeah. Yeah, it's exciting on kind of two fronts in my mind. It's, you know, we're kind of on one hand building this like MPA experience that is sending that sprinkling of JavaScript that we keep promising, right? Like finally we're getting to that sprinkling of JavaScript, not, oh yeah, we trimmed, you know, all the fat off the top. That's what Marko 4 and partially hydrated things are doing. This is like actually getting really close to sending just the necessary JavaScript. So that's one thing, and that's awesome. But the fact that this approach and the, you know, the analysis around the reactive graph and all that stuff is giving us potential solutions for solving this generic problem of how do you bridge the gap between MPAs and SPAs, I think is super exciting.
Yeah, no, definitely. And actually, there's a question along those lines. And you said that users won't be able to tell the difference between SPA and MPA, but there's one difference. You can't go over MPA. SPA, some pages load immediately. Is that, but I mean, maybe, and I can picture that.
I would say that's not true. Even without this transitional app stuff, this is not true, because the immediate loading is really about prefetching, right? So like if you have a code split SPA and you're navigating to a page that you don't already have in cache, then you're going to have some load time there unless you prefetch, right? Or if you've already cached that page, then you're going to have immediate navigation, but you would also have the same immediate navigation if you had gotten an HTML response that was able to be cached, right? So it's, to me, it's more about prefetching the pages that you can transition to, which you can do with a, you know, traditional MPA today. You would be able to do with this not traditional kind of MPA SPA hybrid. And this is something I think probably we see more in SPAs. The browser APIs for prefetching are probably usable right now. They had kind of, they're more hints than anything. I think pretty much all the browsers are doing a pretty good job of respecting them. But the spec is kind of somewhat that like the browsers can kind of ignore this if they want to.
Yeah, I was going to say the pages that a SPA can load immediately are the ones where they don't load data. And in the case where you're not loading data, then you're also could just cache static HTML. It's like you preload HTML. The guys who this is the experiment that the builder guys were doing actually at first, and the IELTS as well. The guy from IELTS, where they didn't even get to turbo links. They just started prefetching the HTML pages in their MPAs because, like, again, maybe not on Qwik side, but on the well, actually on the builder side it's true too, because they both static generation, but and you know, Astro's the same case. They do static gen. You just literally request the HTML for the next page, and then when the browser actually navigates to it, it's right there already.
Right, and so I mean, actually talking about that, there's also some specs that are you know, coming to the browser, maybe if they but there's portals, there's shared element transitions, right? And so these are going to bring to traditional MPAs the ability to do some of these things as well. And so I don't know, maybe the future looks a little bit different than we described. I don't know. There's certainly trade-offs with all of these approaches.
Yeah.
But if you can preserve an element across navigation and let the browser handle that, then like, yes, you're having to send more HTML because you're going to have to send basically a full page, but if you can tell it how to actually preserve some of those things across, like maybe you can keep a video playing as you navigate around, or some of those things, that gives you a lot of the same benefits. You still get to leverage like the back forward cache that the browser has. So there may be alternative routes here. I don't know. The browser may make some of these things easier for us, but there's definitely trade-offs as well, right? Because you're sending data for things that you already have in the browser, even if it's HTML, which is probably not the greatest overhead. But
yeah, I mean, there's nothing stopping us as well from having some parts, even if they update the URL, to be driven by state and do like a client-side update. So you could have something that is immediate, driven by state. And another thing that could be interesting to explore is actually nested routing with prefetches, which I'm not 100% sure Remix might do something similar
I think they
to
do
that.
some prefetching. Yeah.
Yeah. So, with a nested router, you could say, I'm going to prefetch the next page in this set of tabs that's in this hierarchy, but I don't need to prefetch the outer stuff, right? Like we could do that kind of thing as well, which would be pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just saw on Twitter today that thing of Steve Jobs being like, the Safari is in the iPhone, and that is how like Web 2.0 and Ajax, that is how apps are going to be built and all that stuff. And boy, yeah, that didn't pan out. But I think this architecture truly is going to make it possible to build performant like web experiences that wouldn't have been easily possible before. Like you probably would have reached for a spa, and now you've got this janky, amount of like, especially the loading performance. So yeah, anyways, I think the future is bright for the web if this all pans out, hopefully.
Okay, no, that's not the one I was looking for. I was looking for this one. Did you mention when Marko 6 beta was coming out? Let me be political on that one. I'll handle this for a second. We are working on stuff right now. We've set up a bunch of milestones. I've talked about this a bit externally, but I think only in our Discord. Essentially, our milestones are pre-alpha, alpha, beta, and then release. At least there'll probably be an RC candidate range too, but that we're probably going to spend the least amount of time in there. Essentially, right now, what you're seeing was what we call the pre-alpha. We wanted to make it work to do MVC and for JS Framework Benchmark, and that's what we're demoing today. So we just wrapped that up. The next stage we call alpha is when we're going to pull in the hydration stuff. Our expectation there is that this is still going to take us a couple months to kind of work through a lot of details. This isn't the only stuff we're working on right now. We're actually also looking at TypeScript support, which I know some people care about for some reason. Haven't really figured out why, but they seem to like.
It's a good thing.
Yeah. So TypeScript support in the templates, obviously. So like there's some kind of play there in terms of time, but generally speaking, we figure it's a couple months effort on top of where we're at right now, although everything's taken longer than we expected. So take that with a grain of salt, which points us to early summertime period, early summertime period. Our hope there is that from that, we're going to kind of build out the new async model, which will be like our version of suspense or whatnot. And that will hopefully kind of complete the feature set for Marko 6. And again, these things are all kind of, a couple months. And then from there, stabilization, migration, documentation, everything for the release of Marko 6. So that's really rough. You can kind of project where that falls, give or take an extra month here or there, but that's essentially what the timeline is. We were working on prototypes for a very long time. We're doing a lot of experiments. Now we're building for real. We're still hitting a few snags, but generally speaking, the design seems consistent. So I'm pretty optimistic about our ability to get stuff in people's hands. Even when we get to alpha, we're going to start doing some kind of closed trial stuff, and then beta should, as I said, hopefully mid end of the summer, we'll have beta that people can get their wider use and people get their hands on. Does this new version? Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you caught the beginning of the stream. That was basically the whole focus of it, because the way that the tags API and the stuff works in terms of, both composition, in terms of the way that it just kind of extends and augments the existing HTML, and it lends to a lot of the objectives here, both the simplicity in terms of just starting from some markup and enhancing it, but also just the way that it lets us break templates apart and it lets us like refactor. I think the refactoring story is going to be really good. I think like the authoring story is going to be really good. And then when we, add stuff like TypeScript and ESLint, we've got, most of the other stuff like Prettier and Storybook and all that kind of stuff. But once we kind of finish up on the TypeScript and ESLint side, you should have kind of the completion of the story, so to speak, have those auto completions and stuff people like. We've been using Vite a lot. That's a big part of that. We have isomorphic SSR, or sort of HMR in that, at least with the current Marko 5. So we continue building on top of that kind of foundation. We've been using it for quick deploys of things like Cloudflare workers and fast integration and different stuff like that. I expect that we'll kind of build up more on top of Vite, more plugins, more like built-in capabilities. Right now, our Marko serve is something that we built on top of Webpack. I wouldn't be surprised in the future if we, once a few more things get ironed out there, that we can look at moving things to the Vite side as well. So, like, a lot of developer experience considerations going into this work, because the key part, as you said, like, we didn't go the dot server approach, or is like, we really see a future where you can just naturally author your apps, and that kind of piece isn't too much of an consideration there. It might be like a slightly more advanced topic in terms of like how to optimize what goes on client server, but the base experience is just write some HTML, add some behavior, and let Marko take care of the rest. Yeah, then the router stuff probably next year. Yeah, realistically, with everything else, I think this is a 2023 kind of thing. I mean, it'd be sweet to work on it and see how stuff goes while we're, doing other stuff, but it's going to come down to timing and resources. I don't know if Dylan wants to.
Yeah, maybe.
We've been trying. Vite is very future facing, future thinking, which is great, and I've enjoyed it, especially on Solid. On Marko, we've hit a few other things, and it's harder for eBay too. It's just some code bases have this module format called CJS. You may have heard of it before, and Vite kind of doesn't, like, if you have some non-standard format, like a template, like a Marko or Svelte file, once you try and go back out to CJS, everything just, the world breaks. And I think it has to do with the way ESBuild fits into the build system and all this stuff. But essentially, there's just some awkwardnesses, and some of the other frameworks that are newer and jumped in Vite, like Solid and even Svelte or Synergy, they're like, it's fine, no one uses CJS. That's not true for eBay, and that's not true for any large organization with a legacy code base. So we're trying to find ways to work around it. The Svelte guys, to give them credit, have actually been working on this and come up with some really interesting hacks around it to make it work, and we might be able to emulate some of that.
They're doing it for different reasons, but it does have the side effect that you can use CGS from the Svelte file. So if we're ideally, Vite would add APIs so that we could do this without all the hacks that they're doing. But yeah, it should be possible to get it working in a way that we could use it within eBay, but that is not the state of things right now.
Yeah. I mean, we would love to be fair. Like, as many there's Marko team actually supported their own bundler, Lasso, which did like real-time bundling, like on request, which is incredibly capable and it makes great for dev environment. And it's really powerful, but it's also something that was only like, I mean, it was used in various places, supported by the Marko team, supported by eBay. And it does, a lot of eBay still uses it. The majority of eBay's Marko still uses it. And truth of the matter is, until recently and pre-Vite, like Webpack didn't really fit, where we needed to be. We have moved to using Webpack and Webpack 5 and stuff. But generally speaking, something Vite would be very welcomed if we could figure out how to get it to work, because it kind of carries on some of the ideas and legacy that Lasso had. Lasso, again, was a really, really ahead of its time technology that, that you build it and then you're supporting it forever.
Right. Yeah. Vite is like one of the first bundlers maybe the first bundler in a long time, besides Lasso, to acknowledge that there's a server. Right.
Yeah. I mean,
so there's a lot of nice things about it, and actually some aspects of using it, if you didn't have to consider legacy, like we love the developer experience of using Vite with Marko. But yeah, for because of a few issues, it makes it hard for us to bring into eBay, but eventually we probably will.
I mean, if
Bun gives good hooks to actually make it so that we can compile to what we want with Marko, because I mean the thing with Marko is, because we decide what ultimately goes in the bundles, we need control over the more control over the bundlers than a lot of other frameworks do. But if we get the right hooks in Bun, I am definitely excited to try it out.
Yeah. I'm glad some questions came in. You guys were pretty quiet on the stream altogether. Maybe it was just a lot to take in, but it's good to have a little bit of conversation going. But I last called it before. I am last calling it right now. To people's knowledge, just so you guys understand, I do my streams late because with the work hours and stuff, and maybe I should have considered pulling this forward, but all three of us are in different time zones. Oren just woke up, but to put this in perspective, Dylan's an hour ahead of me, and Michael is East Coast.
It's 2:30 a.m. here.
Yeah, so
I was tired before the stream began.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to call it here. I'm just chatting a bit just to give you guys that last moment to type in your question. But yeah, I think we are done here. Thank you so much for everyone who joined the stream. Thank you, Michael and Dylan, for staying up so late to talk about this stuff. I think it's really compelling stuff, and I hope people will go back and re-watch parts of the stream and kind of let some of the stuff sink in. I think a lot of the hints of what the future web dev could be exist in the stream, and it's really awesome how Marko has kind of incorporated a lot of, has a lot of original ideas. We incorporated, some of the other stuff that we've been seeing around the ecosystem and kind of bring it all into this cohesive package. So I think this was a really exciting one for me, and thank you all for joining. All right.
Thanks, everyone. It was fun.
All right.
Now I need to go to bed. Goodbye.